Some mistakes carry the weight of destiny. Frost on the grass. A barn with 9 empty stalls. A man who stopped living 23 years ago but forgot to stop breathing. Then the wagon came. Before dawn, heavy-axled, something alive inside it. The horse that stepped down that ramp was black as the space between stars. 17 hands of barely contained force. 1 white sock on the left rear leg. Eyes that looked back through the slats not like an animal registering a stranger, but like something that had been searching and had finally arrived. The man lifted the mane. 3 letters burned into the hide. Small, deliberate, hidden where only someone who knew would look. His hands went cold from the inside. The brand belonged to a woman 23 years dead. The bloodline everyone thought was gone forever. It wasn't gone. It had come home. Some frost had already claimed the lower field by the time Gideon Trace dragged himself out of bed that October morning. Not the killing kind, just the quiet kind. The kind that turned the grass silver before dawn and made a man feel like the world had gone cold while he wasn't paying attention. Which, if he was honest with himself, was exactly what had happened. 23 years of not paying attention. 23 years of watching the frost come and go and come again without once thinking it meant anything at all. He pulled on his wool shirt first. Dark green, faded at the elbows. The kind of garment that had stopped being new so long ago that newness seemed like a foreign concept. Then the canvas trousers, stiff in the knees, tucked into the tall leather boots he set by the door every night out of habit rather than pride. The boots needed resoling. He knew that. He'd known it since July. And still, he pulled them on and told himself he'd get to it later, which was the same thing he told himself about the fence posts on the north edge, and the water trough with the cracked seam, and the gate to the second paddock that swung wrong on its hinges, and had swung wrong for going on 4 years now. The vest came next. Black wool, double-breasted, with the small brass buttons Clara had sewn back on the bottom 3 times because he kept losing them. The last time she'd done it, she'd shaken her head and told him he was harder on buttons than any man she'd ever known. That was 1,864. He still had all 5 buttons. He hadn't lost a single one since she'd said it, and he didn't know what to do with that fact except carry it around like everything else he carried. The kitchen held the particular silence of a room built for 2 people that had been housing one for too long. A single plate upended in the drying rack. A single mug on the table. The cook stove still threw decent heat because he'd learned to bank it right the night before, and that was something at least. One thing in this house that worked the way it was supposed to. He poured coffee from the pot he'd set before bed, black and already cooling faster than he wanted, and stood at the window that faced east. The valley opened up below the ridge in the way it always had, wide and gray in the pre-dawn, the distant line of mountains still holding their summer snowpack like something they weren't ready to give up. Clara had loved this view. She'd said once, early on, that she'd picked this particular piece of ground not just for the grass or the water access, but for the way you could see weather coming from 3 directions before it arrived. She'd said a rancher with good visibility had half the battle won before it started. He drank the coffee. He did not think about Clara. He thought about the fence posts. The barn sat 40 yards from the back door, and walking to it in the early dark was the one part of his day that still felt purposeful, even when nothing else did. His boots crunched through the frost-stiffened grass. His breath came out in short white puffs that dissolved before they got anywhere. The barn door had a particular resistance to it in cold weather, the wood swelling against the frame, and he had to lean into it with his shoulder to get it moving. 23 years of that same lean, that same give, that same creak of protest from the hinges. His body knew the exact angle without his mind having to participate. 3 stalls occupied, 9 empty. He went to the occupied ones first because that was the order of things. Jim Hensley's 2 draft horses, both past their working prime, boarded here on a gentleman's arrangement that mostly meant Gideon fed them, and Hensley came by once a month with a handshake and whatever news had accumulated in town. The horses were a bay gelding named Colonel, and a broad gray mare with no official name that everyone called Soup, for reasons that predated Gideon's knowledge of her. He checked their water, forked fresh hay into the mangers, ran his hand along Colonel's flank out of habit and found no heat, no swelling, nothing to worry about. Then Dr. Alma Briggs's patient, the sorrel mare with the fractured cannon bone. 3 weeks into a slow recovery that was going about as well as these things went, when the animal in question was cooperative and the vet was competent. The mare turned her head when Gideon came close and nickered low, a sound that meant she recognized him and didn't mind. He checked the wrapped leg, pressed gently along the bone line, found no new warmth. Alma had done the work correctly. She always did the work correctly, which was more than he could say for Doc Henderson before her, who had been competent enough but prone to overconfidence in the way that men who'd never been wrong often were. The 9 empty stalls stood in the dimness beyond the 3 occupied ones like a held breath. He didn't look at them directly anymore. He'd learned not to, in the same way you learned not to look directly at the sun. Not because it would blind you, because it reminded you of what you couldn't have. He'd sold the last of Clara's horses 2 months after the funeral. Not because he'd needed the money, though the money had helped, because he couldn't walk into this barn and see them. Because they'd been hers in a way that went beyond ownership. The way her hands had known each one of them. The way she'd named them and tracked their bloodlines in those neat notebooks she kept on the desk by the window. And the way they'd responded to her voice different from how they responded to anyone else. The buyers had come quickly. Word got out fast when quality animals were available. And Gideon had stood at the fence and watched them load, one by one, into transport wagons headed for other valleys and other ranches, until the last gate had closed and the dust had settled and there was nothing left in any of the stalls except the smell of horses that weren't there anymore. He'd thought it would hurt less after that. It hadn't hurt less. It had just hurt differently. He finished the morning chores in the methodical silence he'd developed over 2 decades of doing them alone. Filled water buckets, checked latches, spread clean straw, made a mental note about the hay supply that he filed alongside all the other mental notes he never actually acted on. By the time he walked back to the house, the sun had crested the eastern ridge and the frost was already retreating from the grass, pulling back toward the shadows under the fence rails and the north side of the barn where it would linger until mid-morning. He poured a second cup of coffee and did not sit down. Standing at the kitchen window had become his substitute for living inside the hours between morning chores and whatever small task he could invent to fill the afternoon. He stood and watched the valley. He stood and watched the road that ran along the lower fence line, empty most days, carrying a rider or a wagon maybe once or twice a week. He stood and held his coffee and told himself he was fine, which was a word that had been slowly losing its meaning for 2 decades and now meant approximately nothing at all. The photograph on the shelf above the cook stove was the only one he'd kept out. Clara, at maybe 35, standing beside Storm Dancer, their best mare, the one with the white star on her forehead and the bloodline Clara had spent 8 years developing to exactly the temperament she wanted. Clara's hand rested on Storm Dancer's neck with the ease of someone who'd never had to think about where her hands went around horses. Her smile in the photograph was the particular kind that happened when someone forgot a camera was pointed at them, which was the only kind of smile worth keeping. He didn't look at the photograph anymore, not really. It was just there, the way the coffee pot was just there, and the cracked seam in the water trough was just there. Part of the furniture of a life that had mostly stopped happening. The sound of a horse coming up the road from town reached him before the rider came into view. He knew the rhythm of it. Wade Decker's roan gelding had a slightly uneven stride from an old stone bruise that had healed wrong, and the sound of it was as recognizable as a voice. Gideon watched through the window as Holt Decker came through the gate at a walk, his broad shoulders settling back in the saddle, the way they always did when he was arriving somewhere rather than going somewhere. Holt Decker had been the county marshal for 31 years. He was 62 years old, still built like a man who worked for a living, with the kind of face that had been weathered past the point of looking either old or young, and now just looked like itself. His hat, a wide-brimmed plainsman style in dark brown felt, sat slightly forward on his head in the manner of a man who'd never learned to wear a hat for anything other than function. His vest was the brown leather one with the star pinned to the left chest, worn over a white cotton shirt with a collar that he kept buttoned even when the weather didn't require it. He had opinions about collars. He'd shared them more than once. Gideon opened the back door before Holt reached the porch, not as a courtesy, just because standing in the doorway gave him something to do with his body. Holt tied the roan to the post and came up the steps with the careful deliberation of a man whose knees had started registering their objections. He pulled his hat off when he came inside, which was the only concession to indoor manners he reliably observed, and set it on the table, without asking permission. "You eat anything this morning?" He looked at the single mug and the cold cookstove with the expression of a man who already knew the answer. "Coffee counts." "Coffee does not count." Holt settled into the chair across the table with the ease of long familiarity and looked at Gideon the way he'd been looking at him for 23 years. Not with pity, with patience, which was worse. "Sit down. I'm fine standing. You're always fine standing. Sit down anyway." Gideon sat because it was easier than arguing. He refilled his mug from the pot and did not offer Holt one, which Holt accepted without comment because he was not actually there for the coffee. "Came through town yesterday," Holt said. "Stopped by Owen's place." Owen Stacks ran the general store on the main street of Redstone, had been running it since he'd inherited it from his father 12 years ago. He was the kind of man who knew everything that passed through a valley, because everything that needed buying or selling passed through his store eventually. He was not a gossip exactly, more a natural repository of information who considered it a civic duty to pass relevant things along to relevant people. "Owen says there's been a buyer up from the south." Holt turned the brim of his hat in his hands, which meant he was working up to something, asking around about horses. "Quality animals, not range stock. Specific bloodlines," Owen said. "Paying above market without much argument." Gideon looked at his coffee. "Buyers come through every fall. This one's particular." Holt set the hat down on the table and looked at Gideon directly. "Name of Moss, Colonel Arden Moss, out of the southern ranches. Big operation, multiple properties. Word is he's expanding north." He paused. Owen said Moss was asking about animals with a specific brand. Older brand, not current operations. The kind of mark that would have been on animals from, say, a breeding program that ran 25 years ago. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. "Lots of brands in this valley," Gideon said. "Lots of brands," Holt agreed. He looked at the photograph above the cook stove, then back at Gideon. "Owen mentioned it because he thought you'd want to know. That's all." That was not all, and they both understood it. But Holt was a man who'd learned when to push and when to leave space, and 23 years of weekly check-ins had given him a fairly accurate read on which of those was called for on any given morning. He stayed for 20 minutes. He talked about the weather, about the Morrison family's new water claim on the creek north of town, about a stray gelding someone had found wandering the ridge road with no brand and no papers. He ate the piece of cornbread Gideon found in the cloth on the shelf, which was 2 days old and had gone slightly dry, and declared it acceptable. When he left, he put his hat back on, at exactly the angle it had been at when he arrived, a precision that suggested long practice, and walked back to his horse without looking back. Gideon stood in the doorway and watched him go. Colonel Arden Moss, asking about branded animals from old bloodlines, paying above market without argument. He closed the door and went back to the window. The afternoon carried him into town because the feed supply needed replenishing, and he was out of lamp oil, and there was no getting around the practical facts of keeping a working ranch, even a barely working one. He hitched his brown gelding, Buck, to the wagon, and took the 2-lane road that cut along the river bottom and came up into Redstone from the south end of the main street. The town had not changed appreciably in 40 years. Same wooden storefronts, same dust in dry weather and mud in wet, same smell of horses and sawdust and cook's smoke that hung in the air regardless of wind direction. Owen Stacks's general store occupied the corner where Main crossed Second, a 2-story building with a covered porch running the full width of the front, the kind of establishment that served as the social center of a small community, not because anyone had planned it that way, but because everything people needed tended to be there. Owen himself was behind the long counter when Gideon came in, wearing his work togs, the leather apron, the flannel shirt in a blue so faded it had almost become its own color, the heavy trousers that he tucked into his boots winter and summer alike. He was a solid man of 55 with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of forearms that came from a lifetime of shifting heavy goods, and he looked up from the invoice he was working through with the expression of a man who'd been expecting this particular customer and had been readying what he was going to say. "Gideon." He set the pen down. "You hear about the buyer?" "Holt stopped by this morning. Thought he might." Owen moved around the counter without being asked, going to the back shelves where the feed and oil were kept. He knew what Gideon came for as well as Gideon did. Moss is a particular kind of buyer. Not the kind that haggles. The kind that already knows what he wants and considers the price a formality. What do you know about him? What I know. Owen stacked 2 tins of lamp oil on the counter. He was an officer. Real one, not honorary. Ran cattle in the South for 15 years after the war. Built up a good operation. Runs a tight ship, people say, which usually means he runs it like a military campaign and doesn't much care what his hands think about it. He paused, lifting a 50-pound sack of oats with practiced ease. He's been buying horses for about 8 months. Not for work, for breeding. He's got money and he's got land, and what he's apparently lacking is quality bloodlines. Lots of people can help him with that. Lots of people could. Owen looked at him steadily. But he's not asking about lots of people's bloodlines. He's specific, Gideon. About the kind of breeding. Temperament-focused, intelligence-focused. Old-line quarter horse stock developed for working partnership, not speed or show. He let that sit for a moment. Sound familiar? It sounded like Clara. It sounded exactly like Clara, which was the kind of thing that hadn't surprised Gideon in 23 years, because nothing surprised you anymore after long enough. But it settled in his chest with a particular weight that he had to concentrate on breathing around for a moment. Could be a lot of people's programs, he said. Could be, Owen agreed, not agreeing at all. I'm just telling you what I heard. You do what you like with it. Gideon paid for the oil and the oats and carried them to the wagon himself, which was the same thing he'd been doing since he was 30 years old, and which he refused to require help for on principle. He drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon light, the mountains going amber, and then copper as the sun dropped behind them, the shadows stretching long across the valley floor. Clara had called this the honest hour, the hour when the light stopped flattering anything and showed you what was actually there. He put the supplies away and fed the horses their evening grain and walked back to the house in the dark. He ate supper standing at the cook stove. He washed the single plate. He went to the porch with a glass of whiskey he rarely finished anymore. Mostly because drinking enough to feel different required effort he couldn't usually manufacture, and he sat in the chair that faced west and said what he said every night. Another day, Clara. The words went into the dark yard and the dark valley beyond it and did not come back. Same as yesterday, same as tomorrow will be. He didn't know why he kept saying it. Some accountant in his chest that needed to keep the books balanced, maybe. Some part of him that refused to believe the conversation was entirely one-sided, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. He sat until the cold drove him in. He wound the clock on the mantel shelf, which had been Clara's clock, a plain brass mechanism in a wooden case that kept reasonable time, and carried it nowhere but kept it wound because it had been hers, and because the sound of it ticking was the only sound in the house at night besides whatever the wind was doing. He went to bed at the same time he went to bed every night. He lay in the dark on the left side of the mattress, which was his side, the right side still slightly indented from a habit of years that the springs hadn't entirely forgotten. He looked at the ceiling and waited for sleep to come. He didn't know that everything was already in motion. He didn't know that 20 miles away, in a freight yard at the junction outside Billings, a man with bad handwriting and a poorly lit office was copying an address from one manifest to another and making the kind of small error that changes nothing, except when it changes everything. He didn't know any of that. He knew the sound of the clock and the cold draft from the north window and the particular quality of dark that settled over the valley on clear October nights. He knew those things completely. He slept. The phone was a thing he didn't have, which in 1887 in Redstone, Montana Territory was not a distinction worth noting, because no one in the valley had one. What he had instead was the sound of a wagon coming up the road before dawn, a sound he registered in his sleep and couldn't quite parse into meaning until he'd been awake for a full minute and standing at the bedroom window looking out at the gray pre-dawn. A freight wagon, heavy-axled, with the particular gait of a rig carrying something live. He could tell from the way the driver was handling the team, holding them slightly wide of their natural pace, compensating for movement in the bed. You learned to read that in the horses if you'd worked with transported animals long enough. He dressed quickly. Not with alarm, exactly. With the alertness of a man who'd been woken from sleep that wasn't restful, and whose instincts had snapped forward before his thinking mind had caught up. Boots first, then trousers already half-tucked, then the wool shirt he'd worn the day before because it was the nearest, then the vest. He was outside and crossing the yard before he'd consciously decided to be. The wagon came through the gate at a walk. The driver was young, 25 at the outside, wearing a low-crowned canvas hat and a brown wool coat that had seen more winters than he had. He had a clipboard resting on his knee and the particular expression of a man delivering something he wasn't entirely sure about. He pulled the team to a halt 30 feet from the barn and looked down at Gideon with the careful assessment of someone who'd been given specific instructions about this delivery. Looking for a Mr. Gideon Trace. Trace Ranch, Redstone Valley. You found him, sir. The driver consulted his clipboard in the way people consulted things when they already knew what was on them but wanted to appear thorough. I have a transport order here for 1 Stallion, black, 17 hands, delivered from the Aldrin breeding operation outside Billings. Manifest shows this address. Your name? Gideon felt the statement arrive in him without quite landing. I didn't order a horse. No, sir. The driver turned the clipboard to show him the top sheet. But someone did. Orders paid in full. Transports paid. Papers are in order. I'm telling you I placed no order. I understand that, Mr. Trace. The young man's voice carried the patient quality of someone trained to deal with confused recipients. But the manifest is made out to your name at this address, and my instructions are to complete the delivery. If there's been a mistake on the origin end, that's a matter between you and whoever filed the paperwork. My end is just to get him here. Gideon looked at the wagon bed. It was a proper transport rig, the enclosed kind used for moving valuable animals long distances, with slatted sides for air and a drop ramp at the rear. Solid construction. The kind of outfit you hired when the cargo was worth protecting. And from inside it came a sound. Not a whinny. Not the startled noise of a frightened animal. Something with more weight and intent than that. A single sharp blow of a hoof against the floor, then the deep exhalation of breath that was less a sound than a statement. Present. Aware. Impatient with the circumstances. Gideon's feet moved before he told them to. He walked to the side of the wagon and looked through the slats. The horse inside was black. Not dark brown, not dark bay. Not any of the shades that passed for black in poor lighting. Black the way certain nights were black, without undertone or approximation, with a depth to the color that suggested it went further in than the surface. He stood 17 hands if he stood an inch, with the broad chest and clean-limbed build of bloodstock developed for combination work rather than pure speed, and his coat had the particular sheen of an animal in exceptional physical condition. But none of that was what stopped Gideon where he stood. The horse had turned his head toward the slats, toward Gideon specifically, and the eyes that looked back at him through the gap in the boards were dark and still, and possessed of an attention that felt directed and deliberate, the way a person's gaze felt different from an animal's gaze, not in the mechanics of it, but in the quality of the intention behind it. They looked at each other through the slats for what could have been 5 seconds or could have been considerably longer. The horse's ears moved forward fractionally. His breathing did not change. Gideon stepped back from the side of the wagon. "Give me 48 hours, he heard himself say. The driver blinked. "Sir, 48 hours. I'll sort out where the paperwork error is and whose order this actually belongs to. In the meantime, I'll house him, and I'll feed him, and you can come back for him when we've established the right destination." I'm not sure that's procedure. It's better procedure than hauling an animal around the territory while someone figures out their paperwork. Gideon looked up at the driver steadily. "I've been working with horses for 40 years. He's safe here. You have my name on the manifest already, which means I'm already attached to this transport legally. All you're doing is leaving him somewhere he's documented to be while the origin end corrects their error." The driver looked at his clipboard. He looked at the horse, who had moved in the transport box with the controlled power of something that had been still too long. He looked at Gideon with the expression of a young man calculating whether the authority in front of him outweighed the procedural uncertainty behind him. 48 hours, he said. You sign the temporary custody form. I'll sign it. Gideon signed. The driver brought the wagon around to the barn doors and lowered the ramp, and Gideon stepped back to give the horse room. Midnight came down the ramp the way a man comes down from a height when he's not afraid of it but is aware of it, not rushing, not hesitating. Each hoof placed with the consciousness of a creature that understood its own weight and its own consequence. He reached the level ground and stood, head high, nostrils working at the new air. One white sock on the left rear leg, brilliant against the black of him. everything else dark as the underside of a storm cloud. He was the most purely made horse Gideon had looked at in 20 years. The driver loaded his ramp, climbed to the box, clicked his team forward, and left through the gate without drama. The dust from the wagon wheels hadn't finished settling before the sound of the rig was already diminishing down the valley road. Gideon stood 10 feet from the stallion and did not move. Midnight dropped his head slightly and pushed his nostrils forward, reading the air in the long, slow way of horses assessing unfamiliar ground. He read the barn and the valley and the frost in the grass and the old hay smell from the open doors. He read Gideon last, or spent the most time on Gideon last, the deep, slow inhalation and exhalation of an animal, cataloging everything it needed to know about a person before deciding what to do about them. Then he did something unexpected. He held still. Not the tense stillness of a horse preparing to bolt, the different stillness of a horse that had chosen to wait. "All right." Gideon's voice came out quieter than he'd intended. "Let's get you settled." He didn't reach for a lead rope. He turned and walked to the barn, and trusted what 40 years of working with horses told him would happen, which was that an animal of this quality and this temperament, given the choice between following and standing alone in an unfamiliar yard, would choose to follow. Midnight's hooves sounded on the frost-hard ground behind him. Gideon opened the largest stall, the one at the far end, the one that had housed Clara's stallion Thunder Reed for 12 years. He'd kept this stall with cleaner straw than the others, for no reason he could have articulated. Some persistent habits were harder to explain than others. He filled the water bucket and forked fresh hay into the manger and stepped back. Midnight walked in without resistance. He circled the space once with the thorough attention of an animal inventorying its options, then came to the front and gripped the top rail with his teeth, not chewing, holding, considering. Gideon found himself standing in the barn aisle watching this horse think, and realized he hadn't stood in the barn aisle watching anything for 23 years. He'd moved through it, completed tasks in it. He had not stood still in it and looked at something with actual attention. He left Midnight to settle. He had chores to finish, the rest of the morning to move through. He fed Colonel and soup and checked Alma's mare's leg wrapping, which was clean and dry, and showed the right kind of tight warmth that meant healing rather than inflammation. He moved with the body's knowledge of tasks it had performed so many times the mind wasn't required for them. But some part of him kept coming back to the image of those dark eyes through the wagon slats. That quality of directed attention, the way the horse had stood still in the yard. By mid-morning he could not put off what he knew he needed to do. Standard practice for any new animal in his care meant a thorough inspection. Health check, injury history, identifying marks. He went into the stall slowly, talking as he moved, low and even and without particular content because the words mattered less than the tone. Midnight tracked him with his ears, allowed the approach, allowed Gideon's hands on his neck, his shoulders, down his leg, checking the joints and tendons for any history of damage. The old injury on the left front leg he found without looking for it. His fingers knew it before his mind named it. A fracture healed, but not quite right. Someone had put this horse back to work before the bone had finished consolidating. The calcification was correct, but the alignment was slightly off. The kind of error that happened when an animal was pushed past its recovery window by someone who valued the work more than they valued the horse. He pressed his lips together and said nothing. He checked the rest of the legs. Fine. The barrel, the back, the haunches, all carrying the even development of an animal that had been well managed except for that one period of impatience in someone else's care. Then he came to the neck. He ran his hand along the underside of the crest, feeling the dense muscle there, and then moved to the mane itself. Thick, heavy, deeply black, falling in a mass to the right side of the neck. He lifted it. There was a brand beneath it, small, deliberately placed where the mane would cover it. 3 letters burned into the hide with the clean lines of someone who knew exactly what they were doing with a branding iron. Not a livestock brand, not a ranch mark. The precise, unhurried work of a person who had a reason for this mark and cared about it. CT. Clara Trace. Gideon's hands went cold, not from the temperature, from the inside. His fingers released the mane, and the thick black hair fell back over the mark, covering it as if it had never been visible at all, as if he might convince himself in the next few seconds that he had not seen what he had plainly seen with his own eyes in clear October morning light. He backed out of the stall. One step, then another. Then he was in the aisle. Then he was in the yard, and the door to the barn was behind him, and the October sky was above him, and his legs had stopped being reliable. He sat down on the ground. Not a controlled descent. He sat down because standing had become optional. CT, Clara Trace. He knew that brand the way he knew her handwriting, and the sound of her voice and the particular angle of her head when she was thinking through a problem. He had been present the day she'd designed it, standing at the kitchen table while she worked through variations on a piece of scrap paper, and he had been standing beside her the first time she'd put it on an animal. A young mare, Clara had said, had the best confirmation she'd seen from their program in 5 years. He knew the size of the letters, the slight curve of the C that she'd insisted on because straight letters looked incomplete to her, the way the T crossed at exactly the right height. This was not a similar brand. This was not a coincidence of letters. This was Clara's mark on an animal that should not exist, delivered to his gate by accident in the 3rd week of October 1887, 23 years after she had died. Midnight appeared at the top half of the stall door, which Gideon had left unlatched. The horse put his head over the door and looked out at the man sitting on the ground in the yard, with no apparent judgment about the situation. Gideon looked back at him. The valley was very quiet. A meadowlark was calling somewhere in the lower field, the late-season kind of call that was more habit than song. The sun had gotten above the eastern ridge and the frost was entirely gone from the yard. Somewhere down the road, Owen Stacks was opening his store and Holt Decker was starting his rounds, and the ordinary machinery of an ordinary town in an ordinary valley was running the way it always ran. And Gideon Trace was sitting on the ground outside his barn, trying to understand what a dead woman's brand meant on a living horse. He thought about the buyers who'd come for Clara's animals in those 3 brutal months after the funeral. He'd watched each one go, had taken the money with hands that weren't quite working right, had told himself he was being practical, and had known even then that practical was not the word for what he was being. He'd let them all go. Every animal she'd built and developed and cared for, every horse carrying the bloodlines she'd spent 30 years refining, every piece of living evidence that she had been here and had done remarkable work. He'd let it all go because he hadn't been able to stand the sight of them. Now one had come back. Not one of the originals, obviously. 23 years was too long for that. But something that carried her mark. Something with the brand she'd placed on her animals as a signature, as a craftsman's mark, as the proof that this work had come from Clara Trace's program and reflected her standards and her vision. He got up off the ground. His knees protested briefly, a reminder of his own age that he acknowledged and moved past. He went back to the stall door and stood across from Midnight and looked at the horse for a long time. Midnight looked back with that particular stillness he'd shown in the yard. "Where did you come from?" Gideon said. The horse exhaled, a long steady breath, the kind that meant nothing was wrong. The kind that meant I am here and I am waiting to see what you will do about it. Gideon reached out and laid his hand on Midnight's forehead, between the eyes, in the place where horses carried their own particular kind of thinking. The horse did not pull back. He leaned in fractionally, the pressure of several hundred pounds of living animal, expressing something that was not weight so much as response. The first thing Gideon felt in that moment was not happiness. He was not ready for happiness, and would not have recognized it without preparation. What he felt was something smaller and more immediate than that. Something like the faint return of feeling to a part of him that had been numb long enough that the feeling itself was uncomfortable. Like the hand after cold, the sensation before the sensation. He stood there with his hand on the horse's forehead and did not name what was happening to him. He didn't have the vocabulary for it yet. He only knew that the morning felt different from the morning it had been an hour ago, and that whatever came next was going to require something from him that he hadn't been called upon to give in a very long time. He left Midnight in the stall and went to the barn aisle and found the small stool he used for shoeing work and sat down on it and stayed there without moving for a while. The other horses moved in their stalls. The autumn light shifted through the east-facing cracks in the boards and made long gold lines on the dirt floor. He had not sat in this barn without a purpose since Clara was alive. He sat now and let the morning be what it was. When he finally stood up and walked back to the house, he walked differently than he had walked to the barn that morning. He did not know how to describe the difference. He only knew his feet found the ground at a different angle. Like a man who had been carrying something for so long he'd forgotten the weight of it, and had just been reminded, not by setting it down, but by something shifting inside it that made him feel it differently. He stood at the kitchen window and drank the rest of his cold coffee, and looked out at the barn where something impossible was standing in the largest stall. He thought about Colonel Arden Moss, buying horses with specific bloodlines, paying above market. He thought about Clara's brand, small and deliberate, under a curtain of black mane. He thought about 48 hours. It was not enough time, he already knew that. 48 hours was not enough time to understand what had been delivered to his gate on an October morning in 1887, and who had ordered it there, and what it meant, and what it would cost him to keep it or let it go. But it was what he had. He set the mug in the basin. He went back to the barn. The second morning arrived with midnight already awake, which Gideon discovered when he pushed through the barn door before first light and found the stallion standing at the front of his stall with the alert, particular stillness of an animal that had spent the night thinking rather than sleeping. The two draft horses shifted in their stalls at the sound of Gideon's boots. Alma's sorrel mare turned her head with the slow patience of the recovering. Midnight simply watched him come down the aisle with those dark eyes that held the same quality they'd held through the wagon slats the morning before. Attention that felt like assessment, like the horse was running some internal calculation that Gideon had not been informed about and would not be consulted on until Midnight had finished it to his own satisfaction. Gideon stopped 6 feet from the stall door. He did not reach for the latch. This was the part of the work that most people got wrong, and getting it wrong was expensive in ways that weren't always visible right away. You could put a lead on an unwilling horse and move him from place to place and call that horsemanship, and it would work until it didn't, and when it stopped working, the animal in front of you would be something that had learned to perform compliance while holding everything that mattered in reserve. Clara had been the one to name that specific failure. She'd called it the obedience that costs more than the resistance would have. She'd said it about horses and she'd said it about people, and she'd been right in both cases. Gideon stood at 6 feet and let Midnight come to his own conclusions. 3 minutes passed. The barn held the particular cold of an October morning before the animal's body heat had a chance to take the edge off it. Gideon's breath made small white clouds. He did not shift his weight or look away or make any of the unconscious adjustments that people made when they were waiting and felt self-conscious about waiting. Midnight's ears moved first. Forward, then half-cocked, the angle that meant listening more than looking. Then the big head dropped slightly, not the full submission gesture but the intermediate one. The gesture that said, "I am not convinced, but I am considering." Then, unhurried, the stallion took 3 steps toward the stall door and put his nose to the air on Gideon's side of it. Gideon raised his hand palm up and let the horse read it. The inhalation was long and deliberate. Midnight took in everything there was to know about the hand and the man it was attached to. The particular combination of old leather and hay and wood smoke, and something underneath all of that which was simply Gideon. 23 years of solitude compressed into a scent profile that apparently told the horse something worth knowing. Because after a full minute of that inventory, Midnight exhaled against Gideon's palm. Warm, steady breath that carried a weight to it that was not physical. It was not trust yet. Trust was built in layers over time and could not be rushed without being falsified. But it was the door to trust left slightly ajar, which was everything you needed to start. Gideon opened the stall. He spent the first hour doing nothing more than being present in the space with Midnight, moving through the stall's dimensions, touching the walls, the manger, the water bucket, establishing that his movements were purposeful and predictable, and not directed at the horse unless the horse invited them. Midnight tracked him continuously, but without the heightened alertness that preceded defensive action. After 40 minutes, the stallion's hip dropped on one side, the physical shorthand for ease, and Gideon permitted himself the interior acknowledgement that this was going well, while being careful not to let that acknowledgement show in his body, because horses read anticipation the same way they read threat. By the time the October sun had gotten properly above the ridge and was doing some actual work on the temperature, Gideon had his hands on Midnight's neck, not gripping, contact. The flat of his palm against the dense muscle, feeling the pulse beneath it, reading what the pulse said about the horse's current internal state. Steady, present, not alarmed. He worked down to the legs, left front first where the old injury lived, His fingers found the calcification again and followed it with the kind of attention that was not judgment so much as understanding. Whoever had pushed this horse past his recovery window had done it from impatience rather than malice, probably, which did not excuse it but meant something different about the kind of damage it left behind. Not the damage of cruelty, but the damage of insufficient care, which healed differently and left a different kind of mark. He straightened up and looked at Midnight's profile. The strong jaw, the broad forehead, the particular set of the eye that Clara had always said was the first thing to read in an animal, because the eye told you whether the thinking was happening or whether something had shut it down. The thinking was happening. Plainly, actively, continuously. He had not worked with an animal this alive to itself in years. The realization arrived without fanfare, which was how the most significant realizations usually arrived. He was doing the work he'd done for 40 years with his hands and his patience, and the part of him that had always known how to be in a barn with an animal. And it felt the way a language felt when you'd stopped speaking it long enough to think you'd forgotten it, and then found that you hadn't. The body remembered. The body had been keeping the knowledge without his permission, waiting for a situation that required it. He left Midnight eating hay with the focused absorption of a horse that had decided the accommodations were acceptable, and went back to the house to deal with the practical question of what came next. What came next arrived in the form of Alma Briggs's wagon in the early afternoon. He heard it before he saw it, the light-sprung sound of her medical rig that she drove herself because she'd never found a driver she trusted to get where she was going without wasting time. She came through the gate and brought the wagon to a stop near the barn, with the economy of movement she applied to most things, and climbed down wearing her work togs, the brown wool skirt, the white blouse buttoned to the collar, with the sleeves already rolled to the elbow despite the cold, the leather apron tied at the waist, and the flat-brimmed hat she wore slightly back on her head. The medical bag she carried everywhere had the battered look of something that had been useful for a long time. Gideon was standing in the yard when she came through the gate, which meant she already knew something was different before she'd said a word, because Gideon Trace standing voluntarily in the yard mid-afternoon, instead of inside, or in the barn was not an ordinary sight. She looked at him. Then she looked at the barn. Then she looked back at him, with the expression she used when she was gathering information, before she committed to a response. What happened? He told her. He kept it short because brevity was the register he operated in, but he told her all of it. The freight wagon, the manifest with his name on it, the 48 hours, and then the brand. Alma listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about her that most people in the valley had come to rely on whether they recognized it or not. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Show me. They went into the barn together. Midnight registered her arrival with a rotation of both ears, and a look that was curious rather than defensive, which was a good sign about the quality of his socialization in some earlier chapter of his history. Alma approached the stall door with the measured pace of a woman who understood that her authority with animals came from consistency rather than speed, and stood for a moment letting Midnight take her measure before she reached for the latch. Gideon opened it. Alma went in with her hands at her sides and let the stallion sniff her medical bag, her sleeve, her hand in that order, the same way she approached every unfamiliar animal. Midnight completed the inventory and seemed to find her unremarkable in the particular way that meant he decided she wasn't a problem, which was the most useful verdict. She lifted his mane. She looked at the brand for a long time without speaking. She pulled a small notebook from her apron pocket and made a quick sketch of it, the size and proportion and the slight curve of the C, and put the notebook away. You're certain this is her mark? Not a question, but she said it the way a doctor confirmed a diagnosis even when they already knew, because certainty mattered and there was no shame in stating it aloud. I was there when she designed it. Alma stepped back out of the stall and looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely categorize. Not pity, not the particular blend of sympathy and awkwardness that most people produced when the subject of Clara came up around him. Something more straightforward than that, she was thinking. I know people in the breeding community, she said. Not just here, there's a network of folks from Billings down to the southern range who track bloodlines, keep records. I've consulted on breeding questions before, on the veterinary side. She pulled her hat brim down fractionally against a gust that came through the barn doors. Give me 10 days. I have a contact in the Billings breeding community I've worked with before. He keeps records going back 15 years. You don't need to, I know I don't need to. She picked up her medical bag. I'm going to check the sorrel's leg, and then I'm going to go home and write some letters. The 3 days starts now. She checked the sorrel mare's cannon bone with the same thorough attention she always brought to it, declared the healing on schedule, and left through the gate without the kind of social wind down that most people felt obligated to perform at the end of a visit. He watched the wagon disappear around the bend in the road and stood in the quiet yard with the October sun on his face. The 48 hours expired the following morning, and the freight company's driver did not return. He sent word via a rider to the company office at the junction, and the reply that came back 2 days later said that there was some confusion about the origin of the transport order, and that the matter was being looked into, and that for the time being the animal should remain in his custody pending resolution. He read the letter twice and put it in the kitchen drawer and went back to the barn. The work with Midnight had developed its own rhythm by then. Gideon went in twice a day, morning and afternoon, and each session built from the previous one. He introduced a lead rope on the third day, not to control but to establish the language of it, the feel of the line as communication rather than restraint. Midnight accepted it with the considered patience of an animal that had decided Gideon was worth the investment of attention. By the fourth day, the stallion was following him through the barn aisle on the loose lead with an ease that had taken some horses 3 weeks to reach. What emerged from those sessions was not simply a horse responding to training. It was a horse engaging with training, which was a distinction that mattered enormously and that most people never had the chance to observe, because most horses never had the conditions that allowed it. Midnight didn't just do what Gideon asked. He appeared to be thinking about what Gideon asked, processing it, finding the places where it connected to something he already understood, and building from there. When Gideon introduced a new cue, the stallion would sometimes pause, just briefly, as if translating, and then respond with a precision that suggested he'd grasped not just the cue but the purpose behind it. Clara had believed that this was what the program was supposed to produce. Not animals that performed, but animals that participated. She'd written about it in her notebooks in the careful, specific language she used for things she considered important, and he'd listened to her talk about it over 20 years of shared evenings, and hadn't always fully understood what she meant in the abstract, but had occasionally glimpsed it in the work and recognized it then. He was glimpsing it now. The thought arrived with a quality of pain that was different from the dull ambient pain he'd carried for 23 years. This was sharper, more focused, the pain of recognition rather than absence. Clara had built something remarkable, and here was the evidence of it still living and working, and she had not been here to see it, and that fact sat in him with a particularity that the generalized grief had not prepared him for. He did not examine this too closely. He went back to the work. Holt Decker came through the gate on the 5th afternoon, not the usual weekly check-in but an unscheduled visit, which meant he'd heard something or learned something and was deciding what to do with it. He dismounted from his roan, gelding at the barn doors, where Gideon was working Midnight in the open aisle on a long lead, running the stallion through a series of lateral movements that were ostensibly about physical development but were actually about communication, about establishing that Gideon's body position conveyed information that was worth attending to. Holt stopped outside the barn doors and watched for a full minute before he spoke. The marshal had ridden enough to know what he was looking at, and what he was looking at was remarkable enough to earn silence. That's some animal. His hand rested on the post without gripping it. Where'd he come from, exactly? That's what I'm trying to establish. Gideon brought Midnight to a halt with a slight shift of his hip and let the horse stand. Manifest said the Aldrin breeding operation outside Billings. But the address on the manifest is mine with my name, and I placed no order, Aldrin. Holt turned the word over. I know that name. Not personally, but I've heard it in connection with quality stock. He was quiet for a moment. Gideon, I need to tell you something. Gideon looped the lead loosely over his shoulder and waited. Moss sent a rider ahead. Holt's voice carried the measured quality of a man delivering information he considered potentially volatile. Not to me officially. Word got to me through Owen, who heard it from the man at the stage depot. The rider was asking around about a particular animal. Black stallion, 17 hands, 1 white sock. He paused. He described a brand. 3 letters, small on the neck under the mane. The barn was very quiet. Midnight stood without moving, and looked at some middle distance between Holt and the barn wall. "Moss knows the horse is here." Gideon said it flatly, without inflection, not because he wasn't feeling anything but because inflection in this context would have been a kind of waste. "Knows or strongly suspects." Holt looked at Midnight, then back at Gideon. "He's coming himself. Not sending the rider back. Word is he'll be here by end of week. With papers." "I'd expect so." Holt reached into his vest pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. "This came into the office this morning. Legal notice from Moss's attorney in Helena, asserting ownership of one black stallion, 17 hands, currently believed to be in the temporary custody of one Gideon Trace of Redstone Valley." He held the paper toward Gideon without crossing into the barn. "I'm not serving it. I'm showing you what's coming." Gideon took the paper, unfolded it, read it without rushing. The language was formal and specific and left very little room for ambiguity. Arden Moss claimed purchase of the animal through a transaction with an estate sale executor in the Billings district. He claimed full and uncontested title. He requested voluntary return of the animal within 7 days, or indicated he would pursue legal remedy. "The brand," Gideon said. He folded the paper along its original creases. "The brand means something. It means something to you." Holt's voice was careful. "What it means legally, I don't know. That's not my expertise. Clara's brand on that animal means there's a chain going back to her program. It means whoever bred this horse had access to her bloodlines, which means someone preserved them after I." He stopped, after he'd sold everything. After he'd stood at the fence and watched Clara's life's work drive away in other people's wagons because he hadn't been able to face it. He did not say that part, but the unfinished sentence sat between him and Holt with the weight of everything both of them knew about those 3 months in 1864. Holt let it sit. He was good at that. "What do you want to do?" "I want to know where this horse came from." Gideon looked at Midnight, who had turned his head to look back at him with that steady, attending gaze. "Before I decide anything else." "Alma's looking into it?" "She said 3 days." Holt nodded. He folded his hands on the post and looked at the stallion for a long moment, with the expression of a man who was doing the private calculation that decades of law enforcement trained into a person, the one where you measured what was right against what was possible and tried to find the overlap. "Moss isn't a patient man from what I hear, and he's got resources most men in this valley don't. If he comes here with papers and a lawyer, your 48-hour receipt isn't going to hold much water. I know that. I'm just saying. Whatever Alma finds, find it fast." He pushed off the post. "And Gideon." He waited until Gideon looked at him directly. "Don't make any moves that make you look like you're hiding something. You're not. You received an animal in error and you're doing the proper thing by it. Stay on that ground." He rode out through the gate and left Gideon in the barn with Midnight, and the legal notice, and the sound of the October wind working along the north side of the roof. That night Gideon sat on the porch with the whiskey he didn't finish, and said his nightly accounting to the dark valley, same as always. But the words felt different in his mouth than they usually did, less like an ending and more like a question. He folded the legal notice and put it in his vest pocket, and then he went inside and stood in the kitchen for a long moment, looking at the drawer where Clara's letters had always been kept, the correspondence she'd maintained with other breeders, and with the people who'd bought animals from their program and wanted guidance. He opened the drawer. He'd gone through everything in it 6 months after the funeral, and kept what seemed necessary and disposed of what didn't, or what he'd told himself didn't. The drawer held receipts and warranty papers for ranch equipment and 3 of Clara's breeding notebooks, the ones he hadn't been able to make himself open or throw away. He left the notebooks where they were. He went to bed and lay on his side of the mattress and looked at the ceiling and thought about a brand on a horse's neck and what it would have taken to preserve a bloodline for 23 years without his knowledge. The logistics of it, the commitment of it. Someone had done that. Someone had cared enough about what Clara had built to maintain it after she died, after her husband had sold everything off and retreated into 20 years of mechanical survival. Someone had kept her work alive. He didn't know who that was yet, but the fact of it moved through him as he lay there in the dark, like something warming from a long cold, the sensation you had when you came in from weather and stood close to the stove and felt your hands begin to believe in warmth again. Alma came back on the morning of the 10th day. She came early enough that the frost was still on the yard, which meant she'd left before dawn. which meant she'd found something that warranted arriving before breakfast. Gideon heard her wagon and was at the barn door when she came through the gate. She was wearing the same work clothes as always, the brown skirt and white blouse and leather apron, and she was carrying a leather folder in addition to her medical bag, which she didn't usually carry. She tied her horse to the post and came to the barn without preamble. Midnight registered her arrival with the same ears-forward recognition as before. He had developed a categorization system, apparently, that sorted people into relevant and irrelevant, and Alma had made it into the relevant category after her first visit. "Samuel Reed," she said, and she was already pulling papers from the leather folder. "The name mean anything to you?" Gideon turned it over. No. He was Clara's cousin. Second cousin, maybe. From the eastern part of the family, the branch she wasn't close to. Alma spread 3 pages on the top of the stall door, holding them against a gust from the barn doors. "There was a disagreement in the family before you and Clara were married. She didn't talk about it. She mentioned having family she wasn't in contact with. Didn't go into it. Reed was a cattleman and a sometime horseman. After Clara died, he bought some of her animals from the buyers you sold to. Not all of them. He didn't have the capital for all of them, but the key ones. The breeding quality stock, the animals that carried the core of her program." Alma's finger moved to a handwritten list on one of the pages. "He ran a small operation outside Billings for 15 years. Quiet. Not commercial. Not show. Working specifically to maintain the bloodline, according to the principles he'd apparently learned from Clara's own notes, which she must have shared with him at some point or left accessible somehow." Gideon was looking at the list. Names of horses, dates, bloodline notations in a hand that wasn't Alma's and wasn't Clara's, but had the careful, informed quality of someone who'd been taught to keep records by someone who took records seriously. "Reed died last year," Alma continued. "Illness, not slow. He didn't have direct heirs. His estate went to probate, and his operation was liquidated to cover debts. The horses were sold at auction." She paused, and the pause had weight. "All of them, including Midnight, and Moss bought him. Moss bought him through a middleman at the estate auction. I've been trying to establish whether Moss knew the full provenance, the full chain back to Clara's program. I don't have that yet, but I know this." She lifted the 3rd page. "Reed left a will, not a complicated one, but it has a specific clause about the horses carrying the CT brand." She read it carefully, not from memory but from the paper itself, giving the words their proper weight. "Any animal bearing the mark of Clara Trace's breeding program shall be offered first to Gideon Trace, widower of Clara Trace, before sale to any third party, in recognition of his original claim to the work and in the hope that the program may return to its rightful steward when the time is right." The barn was very quiet. Midnight turned his head and looked at Gideon as if he'd been listening and understood the significance of what had just been said, which was not possible, which was also not entirely something Gideon could dismiss given the general quality of this animal's attention. "That clause wasn't honored," Gideon said. The words came out level and deliberate, because level and deliberate was what he had when the alternative was something he wasn't ready to show. "The executor may not have known about it, or may not have known how to find you, or may not have cared." Alma's voice was steady. She was giving him the information without editorializing about what it meant, which was another thing he'd come to value about her. "What matters right now is that the clause exists, and it's in a legal document, and it says something specific about your right to this horse. Does it override Moss's purchase? That's not my question to answer." She put the papers back in the leather folder and held it out to him. "But I know who might be able to answer it. There's an attorney in Denver, Ruth Kane. She handled a land dispute in the valley 2 years ago, on behalf of a family I treated. Won the case on a question of original claim that most people thought was too old to argue. She's good." Gideon took the folder. "I can write to her," Alma offered, "if you want. She's more likely to respond quickly to a professional contact." He looked at the folder in his hands, at the papers inside it that represented 15 years of someone else's commitment to something he'd abandoned. Samuel Reed, Clara's cousin he'd never met, who had quietly and without any apparent need for recognition gone and preserved what Gideon had been too broken to keep, and who had died without knowing whether his clause would ever be invoked. "Write to her," Gideon said. He said it the way he'd signed the 48-hour custody receipt, the way he'd opened the stall door that first morning, without full knowledge of where it would lead, but with the specific certainty that this was the direction even if the destination was unclear. Alma nodded. She went to check on the sorrel mare, made her notes, adjusted the wrap on the cannon bone with the same steady hands she brought to everything. Before she left, she stopped at the stall door and looked at Midnight for a moment, in the way she sometimes looked at animals when she was assessing them for something that wasn't purely medical. "He's thriving," she said. "Not as a compliment, exactly. As an observation. Whatever you're doing with him, whatever's happening between the two of you in here, he's gaining condition, and he's present in a way that horses don't usually get to be when they've been moved around a lot." She picked up her medical bag. "I thought you should know that." She left. Gideon stood in the barn alone with Midnight and the leather folder, and the sound of the October wind shifting direction outside. He opened the folder again and looked at the clause in Samuel Reed's will. Then he looked at Midnight, who was working through his hay, with the methodical satisfaction of an animal that had decided the current arrangements were acceptable. Someone kept her work alive. For 15 years. In a quiet operation outside Billings that nobody in Redstone had known about, a man Gideon had never met had maintained the thing that Gideon had given up, and then that man had died, and the chain of custody had passed through an estate sale, and a middleman, and a freight company with bad handwriting, and it had ended up at the gate of the one person in the world who had the right to it. He did not believe in coincidence. He hadn't believed in it before Clara died, and losing her had not improved his faith in the arbitrary nature of events. What he believed in was the way patterns emerged from decisions, the way choices made decades ago created the conditions for things that seemed accidental, but were actually the delayed consequence of intention. Clara had made choices. Samuel Reed had made choices. And somewhere in the arithmetic of all those choices, Midnight had arrived at a freight yard in Billings with Gideon's name on the manifest and a brand under his mane that meant more than any bill of sale. He went back to work. The afternoon session was different from the ones before it, not in method but in quality. He could not have articulated the difference precisely. It was the difference between doing a job and doing the right job, maybe. The specific register of effort that happened when you were operating in the place where your ability met something genuinely worth it. He ran Midnight through the patterns they'd built, the lateral movements and the direction changes, and the stops and starts. And the Stallion met each one with an engagement that was no longer simply about assessing Gideon but about working with him. Partnership in the oldest sense of the word. Two minds applying themselves to the same problem from different directions and arriving at the solution together. He stayed in the barn past the usual time. When he came out, the sun was gone and the valley held the blue-gray of early evening, the mountains to the west silhouetted against a sky that was going from amber to dark. He stood in the yard and looked at that sky for a moment. Clara's honest hour, the light that showed you what was actually there. What was actually there was a ranch that had been dying for 23 years, and a horse in the barn that shouldn't exist, and papers in a leather folder that said someone had cared enough to plan for a future that Gideon himself had refused to believe in. He went inside. He cooked something simple and ate it at the table, which he hadn't done in a while. He boiled water for coffee and sat with it while the evening settled and the fire in the cookstove ticked in the cooling. He thought about Ruth Kane in Denver and what she might say about a clause in a dead man's will and the legal weight of a brand that a woman had placed on horses 40 years ago. He thought about Colonel Arden Moss, arriving at the end of the week with legal papers and the expectation of being accommodated. He thought about what it would cost to fight. And then, because the habit of 23 years did not break easily, and because the accounting needed to be kept, he went to the porch and said his nightly words to the dark valley. But tonight, after the usual phrase, there was something additional, something that came out before he'd decided to say it. The thing a man owed when someone had kept faith with what mattered when he himself had not, he said, was not guilt. Guilt was easy and cheap and sat in the stomach like bad food and did nobody any good. What he owed was forward motion. The only honest currency was what you did next. The stars were clear over the valley. The temperature had dropped fast with the setting of the sun, the way it did in October at this altitude, the air going from merely cold to genuinely serious. He went inside and wound the clock and banked the fire and climbed the stairs to the bedroom. He lay on his side of the mattress. He reached his hand to the right side and pressed it flat against the cool ticking, and held it there for a moment, not with the sense of loss that the gesture usually carried, but with something more complex than that. Something that acknowledged loss without being consumed by it. The weight of what had been, held steady alongside the weight of what might still be possible. The clock ticked from the mantel shelf downstairs. The night settled over the valley. Down in the barn, Midnight stood in his stall, or paced it, or lay down if he trusted the space enough yet, and somewhere in the arithmetic of a brand and a will and a freight company's administrative error, a pattern was resolving into something that Gideon had not had in 23 years. Not certainty. Certainty was a luxury for people who hadn't lost what he'd lost. Something older and more fundamental than certainty. The thing you had when you were finally pointed in the right direction even if you couldn't see the destination. The quiet, stubborn, absolute orientation toward a particular forward. He was not happy. He was not restored. He was 66 years old and his knees hurt, and the ranch had needed attention for a decade. And Moss was coming with papers, and there was a fight ahead that he did not have the resources for on paper. But he was going to work tomorrow morning. He was going to go into the barn and saddle the most remarkable horse he'd put his hands on in 20 years, and he was going to continue learning what that horse had to teach him. And Alma Briggs was going to write a letter to a lawyer in Denver. And whatever came next from Moss's direction was going to have to contend with the fact that some things had a weight that paperwork couldn't fully account for. He closed his eyes. The last thing he thought about before sleep took him was the curve of the C in Clara's brand, the way she'd insisted on it, the way it was still there, under a curtain of black mane, on the neck of a horse that had somehow found its way home. Colonel Arden Moss arrived on a Thursday, 4 days before his stated deadline, which told Gideon everything he needed to know about the man, before a single word passed between them. People who arrived early to appointments they had set themselves were not arriving early because of enthusiasm. They were arriving early to establish that the schedule was theirs to alter, that the 7 days they'd offered were a courtesy they could withdraw at their own discretion, that the person on the receiving end of their timeline should understand that even the terms of engagement belonged to the one with the resources to enforce them. 4 riders came through the gate ahead of him, not hired hands. The way they held their reins and the way their eyes moved across the yard told Gideon they were professional security, the kind that wealthy men in this territory employed when they wanted their wealth to be visible without having to announce it in words. They wore good wool coats against the October cold dark colors, and their hats were quality felt in the plainsman style, and none of them were looking at the scenery. They positioned themselves in the yard with the unconscious efficiency of people who'd done this kind of positioning before. Moss came through the gate last. He rode a bay stallion of obvious quality, the kind of horse that cost enough to function as a statement, and he sat it with the particular upright ease of a man who had spent years on horseback before he'd had enough money to stop needing to. The wool coat he wore was black, long, cut for riding, with a collar that stood up against the wind. His hat was a dark brown plainsman style with a wider brim than most, and his gray-streaked mustache was trimmed with the precision of someone who had opinions about presentation. He was 62 years old, and he had the build of a man who'd been physically imposing at 40, and had lost enough of it to look like authority instead of threat, which was generally more useful. He reined the bay to a stop 30 feet from the barn doors where Gideon was standing. They looked at each other across that 30 feet. Neither of them moved immediately, which was its own kind of information exchange. The silent calibration that men of a certain age and a certain set of experiences conducted before they committed to the formal version of a confrontation. Gideon was wearing his usual the canvas work trousers, the wool shirt in the dark green, the black vest with all 5 buttons, the wide-brimmed felt hat that had weathered past any particular color and settled into a shade that meant used. He had not dressed for this. He was dressed the way he dressed every morning, for a working ranch on a cold October day, and he had made no adjustment for Moss's arrival because making an adjustment would have been a communication he wasn't prepared to send. Moss dismounted with the smoothness of long practice and handed his reins to the nearest of his riders without looking at the man. He walked toward Gideon with his hands at his sides, not hurrying, and stopped at a distance that was conversational but not close. "Mr. Trace." His voice was bass and measured, the voice of a man accustomed to rooms where other people waited for him to speak. "I'm Colonel Arden Moss. I believe we have a straightforward matter to resolve. You're 4 days early." Moss's expression acknowledged this without changing substantially. "I find that clarity tends to benefit from proximity. I'm here." You're here. The horse is presumably here. No reason to extend the timeline unnecessarily. The timeline was your offer, and I'm here to revise it. In person, which I consider a courtesy. He looked past Gideon at the barn behind him, a brief and practiced assessment. I have purchase papers for the stallion you're currently housing. Clean chain of title from the estate sale executor in Billings. Payment documented. I'd like to take the animal today and spare both of us the formal legal process. Gideon did not move. The animal has a brand under his mane, CT. Do you know what that brand stands for? Something moved behind Moss's eyes. Not surprise. More like a man encountering an argument he'd anticipated and had already decided was irrelevant. I know there's a mark on the horse. The mark's on purchased livestock transfer with the animal. The brand doesn't change the ownership. Clara Trace put that brand on her horses as a mark of provenance. She built the bloodline this animal comes from over 30 years. The chain of title you're describing starts in the middle of a longer story. All chains of title start somewhere. Moss's voice remained level, but had acquired a quality of finality, the tone of a man who was being patient because he chose to be and could choose differently. What you're describing is sentiment. Courts deal in documentation. Gideon's jaw tightened along a line that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with certainty. Then we'll let them. The yard was very quiet. One of Moss's riders shifted his horse slightly. The sound of midnight moving in the barn behind Gideon came through the wall, a single heavy footfall, and both men heard it. I'll offer you compensation, Moss said, above the documented purchase price. A fair number that recognizes the inconvenience and any sentimental attachment to the animal's history. I'm not an unreasonable man, Mr. Trace, but I am a determined one. That horse is not for sale. The silence that followed had a specific texture. It was the silence of a man who had been told no in a context where he rarely heard it, and was processing what that meant not emotionally but tactically. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Moss said it without heat, which was in some ways worse than if he'd said it with anger. Anger was a pressure you could read and respond to. This was calculation wearing the clothes of patience. I have resources available for legal proceedings that most men in this valley would find prohibitive. I'm offering you an alternative to that process out of simple efficiency. Holt Decker's roan gelding came through the gate at a walk. The timing was not accidental. Gideon had sent word to the marshal's office 2 days ago about Moss's stated arrival date, but Moss had come early, and Holt's presence now meant he'd been watching the road from somewhere above the valley and had seen the riders come through. He rode into the yard with the unhurried authority of a man who belonged in any situation by virtue of the badge on his vest, and he positioned his horse at an angle to the group that was neither confrontational nor deferential. Just present. The way law enforcement presence in a yard full of armed men was designed to work without requiring a word. Moss looked at Holt with the expression of a man recalculating. Holt touched the brim of his hat in the minimal salutation he extended to people whose authority he acknowledged but did not cede to. Colonel Moss. I'm Marshal Holt Decker, county jurisdiction. Everything all right out here? Fine, Marshal. Moss's voice had acquired a new note of precision. Mr. Trace and I are having a business discussion. Sounded civil when I came through the gate. Holt rested his hands on the saddle horn with the ease of a man who had nowhere to be that was more important than here. I'll just stay a moment if nobody minds. Nobody said they minded. That was the point. Moss looked back at Gideon. The calculation was still running behind his eyes, but the parameters had changed. 7 days then, he said, restoring his own offer to its original terms as if the revision had been his idea. I expect the matter to be resolved by then, one way or another. He turned back to his horse, took the reins from his man, mounted with the same smooth economy he'd dismounted with, and led his riders out through the gate without looking back. The dust from 5 horses settled slowly in the cold air. Holt watched them go. He came early, he did. What did he offer? Money. Didn't name a number. Holt was quiet for a moment. Has Alma found anything useful yet? Not yet. Then you've got 7 days to get a lawyer and hope she does. He looked at the barn behind Gideon. That horse worth the fight? Gideon considered the question with the seriousness it deserved rather than answering reflexively. The answer was not simple. The horse was worth the fight, in the way that things were worth fighting for, when they represented something larger than themselves, when what was at stake was not just an animal but a principle and a legacy and the specific terrible weight of 2 decades of abandoned obligation. He was 66 years old and he didn't have unlimited time or unlimited resources, and there was a real possibility that Moss's lawyers would grind him down before anything could be resolved. These were honest facts that deserved honest acknowledgement. Yes, he said. Holt nodded once. Then let's not waste the 7 days. That night the wind came up from the northwest, the advance edge of a weather system that had been building over the mountains for 3 days. Gideon checked the barn twice before dark, made sure the stalls were properly latched and the water buckets were full, and the hay supply was adequate for a couple of days if the storm made the yard impassable. Midnight stood in his stall with the ears-back attentiveness of an animal tracking incoming weather, which horses did better than any instrument Gideon had seen. The stallion's nostrils worked at the changing air coming through the barn's north-facing gaps. "You know something's coming," Gideon said, and Midnight turned one ear toward the sound of his voice. "So do I." He meant the weather. He also meant other things. He went back to the house and sat at the kitchen table with Clara's breeding notebooks and the leather folder Alma had brought, and spent 3 hours going through all of it in the way he hadn't been able to make himself go through anything of Clara's in 23 years. The notebooks were written in her precise hand, the careful documentary style she'd developed for recording things she considered too important for casual notation. Bloodlines, breeding decisions, temperament observations, health records going back to the founding animals of their program. Reading it was like hearing a voice he'd been trying not to hear for 2 decades, sharp and specific and informed, the voice of someone who understood exactly what she was doing and why. He found the entries about Samuel Reed partway through the second notebook. She'd written about him the way she wrote about difficult things, directly, without the softening language that people used when they wanted to avoid the full weight of what they were saying. Reed was her cousin. They had fallen out over the disposition of her father's estate when she was 24 years old. She had not spoken to him in 11 years by the time she wrote the entry. But she was writing about him because she was in the process of reconsidering that silence, because she had learned through the community of breeders she corresponded with that Reed had developed a genuine understanding of horses, and because she had begun to think that pride was a worse long-term investment than she'd previously calculated. The next entry about him was 3 months later. She'd written to him. He'd written back. The entry was brief and contained no dramatics, just the notation. SR and I are in correspondence again. 11 years is a long time to maintain a principle that costs more than it's worth. She hadn't told Gideon any of this. He tried to remember the period of those notebooks, the fall of 1862 or thereabouts, and what had been happening in their life that might have made such a reconciliation easy to conduct privately. They'd been busy. The breeding program had been producing its best animals. He'd been training 2 particularly difficult colts that season, and his attention had been on them. Clara had managed the correspondence side of the operation largely independently. It had not seemed unusual that she received and sent letters he didn't know the specific contents of. She had been conducting a reconciliation with a cousin he'd never met, and making plans that involved him and he hadn't known. He didn't feel betrayed by this. What he felt was something more complicated. The specific emotion of understanding a person more fully after they were gone than you had when they were beside you, which was one of the crueler features of grief and one of its most common ones. He read until the cook stove fire had burned down to coals and the kitchen had gone properly cold. Then he put the notebooks back in the drawer and went to bed and listened to the wind building outside the north-facing window. The storm hit full force around midnight. He knew it had arrived not from the sound, though the sound was substantial, but from the way it came through the walls in the particular vibration of a structure weathering something it had weathered before. The house was solid. Clara had insisted on the framing being done right, had stood over the builders with the specific and unignorable attention she brought to anything she considered important, and the result was a structure that gave the impression of competence when tested. He got up and pulled on his boots and coat and went to the barn. The wind was serious, and the temperature had dropped as another 10 degrees since sundown, and the rain it brought was the stinging, driving kind that found every gap in fabric and collar. He crossed the yard with his head down and his hat brim pulled forward and pushed through the barn door with effort against the pressure differential. Inside, the barn absorbed most of the noise without quite eliminating it. The horses were moving. Colonel and Soup were unsettled in the draft horse way, shifting weight and blowing, their size making their nervousness larger than it would have been in smaller animals. Alma's sorrel mare was standing with her injured leg slightly off the floor, not lame, just protective, and her eyes were showing more white than usual. Midnight was still. The stallion stood in the center of his stall with his head up and his ears moving independently, tracking the multiple sounds of the storm through the walls. His nostrils worked in long, slow cycles. He was not calm the way a dull horse was calm, not simply absent from the situation. He was present in it fully, processing it, and he had arrived at some internal position regarding the storm that did not involve panic. His body showed none of the tension that preceded explosive movement. He was simply there, attending to what was happening around him with the collected alertness of an animal that had decided information was more useful than reaction. Gideon stood in the barn aisle and watched him. There was something instructive about that quality of stillness. Not the stillness of numbness or of having given up on the situation, but the stillness of a creature that had enough internal resources to hold the chaos outside it without being reorganized by it. He had spent 23 years in a different kind of stillness. The stillness of a man who had removed himself from the path of further harm by removing himself from the possibility of further life. What Midnight was demonstrating was not the same thing at all. He settled Colonel and Soup with hay and a low voice and the reliable physical presence of a person who had been in bad weather before and was not impressed by it. He checked the sorrel's leg wrapping, which was dry, which meant the stall was weathering the storm adequately. He spent 20 minutes making the rounds until the horses had calmed enough that his presence was reassurance rather than stimulus. Then he went and sat on the stool in the barn aisle, across from Midnight's stall, and let the storm do what it was going to do. He had not looked hard enough at what was in the back of the barn. That thought arrived as he sat there, not as an accusation but as a simple recognition that there were parts of this property he had avoided for 23 years, with the same determined unconsciousness he'd applied to the empty stalls. The tack room he used was at the near end of the barn. The storage room at the far end, where Clara had kept the records and some equipment and certain things she'd considered too important for the house and too important for disposal. He had entered perhaps twice since she died. Both times he'd stood in the doorway and looked at the shelves and closed the door again. He picked up the lantern from its hook in the aisle and walked to the far end of the barn. The storage room door had a latch that stuck in wet weather because the wood had swollen slightly around the frame over years. He worked it open with the patient pressure of someone who knew the exact angle required. Inside, the lantern light fell across shelving that Clara had built herself, functional and straight, holding the accumulated documentation of their program. Most of it was things he'd already found duplicates of in the house: branded certificates, health records, correspondence files in Clara's systematic organization. In the corner below the lowest shelf was a section of wall where the original builders had left an access panel for the drainage system that ran under the barn floor. Clara had discovered fairly early in their occupation of the property that the space behind the panel was dry and temperature stable, conditions useful for storing things she didn't want to risk to heat or damp. He'd known she used it. He'd occasionally wondered what she kept there specifically and had never asked because the specificity of Clara's organizational decisions had always been her domain, and she'd never given him reason to distrust it. He crouched down. His knees registered their standard protest. He worked the panel free from its frame, pulling it forward and setting it aside, and held the lantern toward the space it revealed. A tin box, plain, about the size of a large book with a tight-fitting lid. He lifted it out. It was heavier than he expected, which meant it held something with substance rather than just papers. The lid had a small hook latch that was not rusted, which meant the tin had done its job and the interior was dry. He carried it back to the stool in the barn aisle and sat down and held it in his lap for a moment before opening it. Inside, wrapped in cloth to protect them from any residual movement, 5 small notebooks, Clara's handwriting on the covers in her characteristic compressed script, numbered and dated. These were not the program records. The notebooks in the house, the ones he'd been reading, had been the official documentation. These were different, smaller, personal, the kind of notebooks that people carried in pockets and wrote in, not for record keeping but for thinking. And on top of the notebooks, wrapped in a larger piece of cloth and sealed with wax that had held its integrity for 23 years, A letter, addressed in Clara's hand, sealed and labeled on the outside with 3 words that Gideon read 3 times before they assembled themselves into meaning. When you're ready. He sat in the barn aisle with the storm working against the walls, and the 3 horses settling and unsettling in their stalls, and the lantern making its small circle of yellow light on the dirt floor, and he held a sealed letter from his dead wife in his hands, and understood that she had known him better than he had known himself. She had known he would not be ready for some amount of time. She had not known how long. But she had known that putting something important in a place that required deliberate seeking was the correct approach for a man who would close drawers and avoid storage rooms and refuse to be found by anything that might require him to feel his own grief in its full dimension. She had prepared for his cowardice with the specific affectionate precision of a woman who loved the man she was dealing with and also had a clear-eyed assessment of his limitations. He opened the letter. It took him longer than it should have to break the wax seal, because his hands had developed an unsteadiness that had nothing to do with the cold. The paper inside was folded twice, in Clara's precise way of folding things, and when he opened it the handwriting was the same as always, the same as the notebooks, the same as the letters she'd sent him before they were married that he still had in a box somewhere in the house, unchanged by the 23 years it had spent sealed in a tin box in the corner of a barn storage room. She wrote the way she talked, directly, without preamble, without the formal salutations that most correspondents used, because she considered them a waste of space that was better used for the thing you actually wanted to say. She knew, she wrote, that he would have sold the horses. She was not angry about it. She had seen the way grief worked in him during the period after his mother died, 20 years before, the way it turned him inward and closed the apertures through which the world ordinarily entered. She had loved that quality in him in other contexts, the depth of feeling that it implied, and she had accepted it as part of the whole of him without conditions. But she had also known that if she did not plan for it, the horses would be gone, and the program would be gone, and the 30 years she had put into it would dissolve as completely as if it had never existed. She could not accept that. Not because she needed the monument of it, but because she believed it was worth something beyond them. Because she had spent 30 years learning how to produce an animal that was genuinely capable of partnership with a person. And she believed that this was not a trivial thing, and she had not wanted it to stop existing simply because she had stopped existing. She had written to Samuel Reed. She explained who he was, knowing that Gideon had not known about him. And she explained why she had reconciled with him, and what she had asked of him, and what he had agreed to. She had structured his participation carefully, she wrote, with the specific clause in his will about the CT animals, because she understood that legal language outlasted sentiment, and that sentiment without legal language was just a wish. And then she wrote what she had written on the outside of the letter's envelope, but at greater length, and the greater length was what undid him. She wrote that she knew this letter would find him only if something had happened to force him to look, which meant something had happened with one of the horses, which meant Samuel or Samuel's arrangements had produced the situation she had designed them to produce. She wrote that she was glad, wherever she was, that it had worked. She wrote that she hoped it had not taken too long, and that she was not saying that as a criticism but as a wish, because she would have preferred he'd had more years of living rather than fewer. And then she wrote, in the plain, specific, undecorated language she reserved for the things that mattered most, "You were never broken by what happened to me. You were only stopped. Those are different things. Stopped means you can start again." He read the letter twice. He read it a third time. The storm outside had reached some kind of peak and was now doing the consistent, loud work of a system that had arrived at full strength and would maintain it for a while before beginning to diminish. The lantern light wavered once as a particularly aggressive gust found some gap in the barn wall. Midnight shifted in his stall, a single adjustment of his weight, and was still again. Gideon sat on the stool with the letter in his hands and did not move for a long time. What was happening in him during that period was not something he would have been able to describe accurately if asked. The closest he might have come was this: 23 years of a particular kind of internal weather was reaching its own peak, the way the storm outside had reached its peak, and on the other side of that peak was the possibility of something different. Not resolution, not the end of grief, which did not end, which only changed its texture over time, but the possibility of moving through the space the grief had occupied rather than remaining fixed in front of it. He was not happy. He was not restored. He was 66 years old and sitting on a wooden stool in a barn in a Montana storm, holding a letter from a woman who had been dead for 23 years and had been smarter than him about his own future even as she was dying. What he was, sitting there, was honest with himself in a way he hadn't been in a very long time. He folded the letter with the same care she had folded it, along the same lines, and put it back in its cloth wrapping and back in the tin box. He sat for a moment longer. Then he stood up, and his knees made their complaints, and he put the tin box on the shelf, where it could be found rather than back in the floor cavity, and he picked up the lantern and walked back down the barn aisle. Midnight was at the front of his stall, watching Gideon come. The lantern light moved across the black coat and caught the particular sheen of it, the way it held light without reflecting it exactly, absorbing it and returning something warmer. The dark eyes tracked him with the attention that had been there from the first moment through the wagon slats, the attention that felt like something more than instinct but less than what humans meant when they used the word understanding. Gideon put his hand on Midnight's neck. He stood there in the barn with the storm working against the walls and his hand on the horse's neck and said nothing at all for several minutes. Then, she planned this. The words came out with the particular quality of a statement, made not for a listener, but for the record, for the simple purpose of having said it aloud in a space where it could be heard. She knew I'd sell everything. She knew I'd close up. She planned 20 years ahead for the day I might be ready to open up again. He felt the pulse under his palm, steady and strong, the living warmth of an animal in good condition. What I owe her is not guilt about what I didn't do. What I owe her is what I do next. Midnight exhaled, long and slow, the quality of breath that horses produced when something in their internal state had shifted from vigilance to something quieter. He stayed in the barn until the peak of the storm had passed, and the sound outside had begun to diminish from its highest register towards something merely significant. When he finally crossed the yard back to the house, the rain had thinned to the persistent, serious kind, and the wind was dropping in pulses rather than gusting. He was soaked through in the 30-yard crossing. He peeled off his coat and boots at the door and stood in the kitchen in his wool shirt and looked at the clock on the mantel shelf. 3 a.m. He thought about Moss's 7 days. He thought about Holt's roan gelding and the steady presence of it in the yard, the thing law enforcement presence said about a situation without saying anything. He thought about Ruth Kane in Denver and Alma's letter, and whether it had arrived yet, and whether it had been answered. He went to the kitchen table and sat down and pulled a piece of paper toward him and wrote, in his own hand, which was not as clean as Clara's but was legible, a letter to Ruth Kane explaining the situation in specific terms. He included the clause from Samuel Reed's will as Alma had described it. He included the description of the brand and the chain of custody he'd been able to establish. He stated clearly what he needed and by when, because Ruth Kane was presumably a busy woman, and busy people responded to clarity faster than they responded to stories. He sealed it and set it by the door to take to town in the morning. Then he opened Clara's letter again and read the last paragraph once more, the one about stopped versus broken, and then folded it again with the same care and put it in his vest pocket against his chest, where it would be close enough to feel the weight of, without having to take it out to be reminded of it. The storm had reduced itself to rain by the time the first gray light came into the kitchen window. He had not slept. He was 66 years old and had spent the night in a barn reading his dead wife's handwriting, and then sitting at a kitchen table writing to a lawyer he'd never met, and his back was registering strong opinions about both activities, and his eyes felt like something that had been used too thoroughly for too long. He put the kettle on for coffee. He stood at the window and watched the rain on the valley. 2 things were happening simultaneously and had been happening for the last several hours without his full conscious attention. One was the practical sequence of what needed to be done in the next 7 days if there was going to be any hope of standing in front of whatever legal process Moss initiated with something more than sentiment. The other was something interior and harder to name, a kind of reorientation that had begun when he'd found the brand and had been accelerating since he'd found the letter. The slow rotation of a man who has been pointed in one direction for a long time beginning to face a different one. He was not ready for what was coming. That was simply a fact. He had no money to speak of, no attorney of record, A claim built on a dead woman's clause in a dead man's will, and the moral weight of a brand that courts had no established framework for evaluating. Moss had resources that would grind him into procedural dust if the thing went long. He also had, in his barn, a horse that should not exist. A horse that his wife had planned for, across 23 years of his absence and neglect, with the specific intention of being here when he was finally ready to receive it. And he had, in his vest pocket, a letter from the person who knew him best in the world, who had known him better than he knew himself, who had written while she was dying, that the difference between broken and stopped was the difference between never and not yet. Moss was coming back in 7 days. 6 days and some hours now. The coffee heated and he poured it and watched standing at the window and watched the rain thin further toward mist, the storm system finishing its business and moving on to whatever valley was next in its path. The fence line along the north pasture was standing. The barn roof had held. The horses were all right. He put his cup down and went to get his coat and boots. He had a letter to take to town, and Alma Briggs to speak with, and a legal case to begin building from a foundation that most people would have considered inadequate. Most people had not had Clara Trace planning their future for them. He opened the back door and stepped out into the cold, clean, post-storm morning and started toward the barn. 11 days passed between the morning Gideon sent the letter and the Tuesday the stage brought Ruth Kane into Redstone. Ruth Kane arrived on the Tuesday stage from Denver, which came into Redstone at 10:30 in the morning and deposited its passengers and mail at the depot on the south end of Main Street with the mechanical reliability of something that had been making the same run long enough to have worn grooves in its own routine. Gideon's was there when the stage pulled in, not because he'd planned to meet her specifically, but because Holt had sent word that morning that Kane had confirmed her arrival by telegraph from the junction, and Gideon had found himself in town without quite remembering the sequence of decisions that had brought him there. She was the last passenger off the stage. She came down the step with the unhurried deliberateness of a woman who had made this kind of descent from this kind of vehicle enough times that she'd developed opinions about the correct way to do it, which was without rushing and without the performance of difficulty that some passengers offered as a bid for assistance. She carried a large leather bag over one shoulder, dark brown and visibly heavy, and a document case under the opposite arm, and she wore a black wool traveling dress with a high collar and the long lines of practical women's fashion in 1887, with a coat over it in dark charcoal that was cut for warmth rather than display. Her hat was a flat-brimmed style in black felt, pinned firmly, the kind of hat that stayed where you put it regardless of wind. She looked around the depot with the quick, organized attention of someone reading a new environment for relevant information, and she found Gideon in approximately 4 seconds, which suggested that either Holt had described him accurately, or there was something in his posture that said, "I am the person you came here for," in a language legible across a depot yard. She came toward him without hesitation. "Mr. Trace, Miss Kane." Mrs. She said it without emphasis, correcting a misapprehension rather than making a point. "My husband passed 8 years ago. I kept the name for professional purposes." She shifted the document case to her other arm and looked at him with the appraising directness of someone who had decided long ago that time spent being indirect was time that could have been spent on the actual work. "Your letter was specific and well organized. That's helpful. Most of my clients arrive in crisis and produce documents in approximately the order they remember them, which is rarely useful. Clara always said clear writing was the first courtesy." Something shifted briefly in Ruth Kane's expression. Not sentiment exactly, more the recognition that a piece of information had arrived and been filed. "I'd like to see the horse and the letter and the will clause before I tell you anything definitive about what we're working with. Impressions formed without evidence are just opinions, and opinions are the least useful thing I carry." He brought the wagon around, and she loaded her bags into it with the efficient self-sufficiency of a woman who had learned early that waiting for help to be offered was slower than doing it yourself. They drove to the ranch in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which Gideon attributed to the fact that she was clearly a person who did not feel the social obligation to fill quiet with noise. She looked at the valley as they drove, the October light on the mountains, the way the grass had gone completely dry and gold after the storm's passage, with the alert observation of someone who gathered information from everything in their vicinity as a matter of professional habit. At the ranch, she went directly to the barn. He had expected this and had not tried to redirect her to the house first. She stood outside Midnight's stall for 2 full minutes before she opened it, watching the horse with the kind of attention that was neither sentimental nor clinical, but something more accurate than either. Midnight watched her back with his usual directed assessment. "He's exceptional," she said, and it sounded like a fact rather than an admiration. "This is the product of considered long-term breeding work. You don't get this by accident. No, you don't." She lifted his mane herself without asking, and looked at the brand with the same unrushed attention she'd applied to everything else. She pulled a small notebook from her coat pocket and made her own sketch of it, different from Alma's, capturing the specific proportions and the curve of the C with the precision of someone who understood that physical evidence described in words was not the same as physical evidence recorded in detail. She came out of the stall and looked at Gideon. "Show me the will clause." They went to the kitchen table. He spread the papers from the leather folder in front of her, the documentation Alma had assembled, and then he put the copy of Samuel Reed's will clause beside them, the one that the Billings attorney's office had forwarded by post after Alma's inquiry. Ruth read everything in order, slowly, without commenting. She turned pages back occasionally to cross-reference something, and made small marks in her notebook with the stub of a pencil she produced from the same pocket as the notebook. She read Clara's letter, which Gideon had put in the folder as well, as the document it was, evidence of intent and of the specific knowledge Clara had held about the arrangements with Reed. She sat back. She looked at the papers. She looked at her notebook. She looked at Gideon. "3 angles," she said. "I want you to understand all of them before I tell you what I think our chances are, because I don't believe in managing people's expectations by withholding the complete picture." He nodded. "First angle, the brand as provenance mark." She tapped the sketch in her notebook. Clara Trace placed this mark on her animals as a craftsman's signature, not merely a livestock identification. There is legal precedent in territorial courts for the argument that such marks carry with them implied rights of provenance, meaning the mark's originator retains a recognized interest in how the marked work is used and transferred. It's been argued successfully in 2 cases I know of involving bred livestock in Colorado territory. She paused. It's not strong standing alone, but it contributes to the picture. Second angle, she moved to the will clause. Samuel Reed's clause is the most concrete thing we have. It is legally specific. It names you by name. It establishes that the animals carrying the CT mark were to be offered to you as a priority before any third-party sale. The estate executor either did not know this clause existed, did not know where to find you, or chose not to honor it. If we can establish which of those is true, and particularly if we can establish that the executor had access to the clause and proceeded with the auction regardless, then Moss's purchase is built on a transaction that violated the clause's terms. She let that settle. That doesn't automatically void his purchase, but it gives a court grounds to question whether the transfer of title was complete in the legal sense. Third angle. She looked at him directly. Moss's conduct. I want to know whether his representative was aware of the will clause before the purchase. If someone acting on his behalf knew that clause existed and proceeded with the purchase through a middleman specifically to avoid triggering it, that is a form of bad faith acquisition that courts take seriously. It doesn't look like an honest mistake. It looks like deliberate circumvention of a legal obligation. She picked up her pencil. Do you have any correspondence between Moss's people and the estate executor or the middleman? Not yet. Alma Briggs has been working the network of breeders in the area. Get me that correspondence if it exists. The moment I have evidence that Moss knew about the clause and proceeded anyway, the case becomes substantially stronger. She closed her notebook. Now I'll tell you what I told you I would. Our chances. He waited. Without the bad faith angle, we're fighting an uphill case on moral grounds with partial legal support. We might win. We might not. Territorial judges are individuals, not algorithms. And the quality of the argument and the clarity of the story matters as much as the doctrine. She looked at him steadily, the way she'd looked at everything, without softening it. With the bad faith angle, we have a case that most judges in this territory would find at minimum worth taking seriously, and at maximum genuinely persuasive. Moss's money and lawyers don't disappear, but they're working against something real rather than something primarily sentimental. What do you need from me? Access to everything. The breeding records, the correspondence, anything of Clara's that bears on the program. and the provenance of the horses she marked, and your testimony, when the time comes, which needs to be specific and unemotional. Not because emotion is inappropriate to the facts, but because a courtroom is a place where precision does more work than feeling. She stayed for the afternoon. She went through the breeding records from the kitchen, with the systematic attention she'd applied to everything, making notes, cross-referencing dates against the will clause timeline to establish the chain of custody from Clara's original animals through Reed's program to midnight. By the time the October light had dropped to the level where the kitchen needed a lamp, she had a working chronology laid out on the table that demonstrated, in documentary terms, the connection between Clara's program and the horse currently standing in Gideon's barn. "This is a good foundation," she said, gathering her notes. "Better than I expected, frankly, given that the core of the program was dispersed 23 years ago. Your wife kept exceptional records. She kept exceptional everything." Ruth Kane looked at him for a moment with the specific quality of attention she saved for things she was assessing rather than cataloging. Then she went back to her papers and said, without particular emphasis, "The people who build things carefully and then plan carefully for those things to outlast them are rarer than they should be. What she did for you, setting the Reed arrangement in motion while she was dying, knowing you might not be ready for years, possibly never. That's not a small thing to carry." He said nothing. "I'm not saying it to make you feel something," she clarified. "I'm saying it because it matters to how I'm going to argue this case. What she did is documented and deliberate and patient, in a way that speaks to the character of the work and the seriousness of the intention. That's an argument, not just a story." She left before dark, heading back to the boarding house in town where Holt had arranged accommodations. Gideon stood at the barn doors after her wagon disappeared down the road and listened to the valley settling into evening, and thought about what she'd said about precision doing more work than feeling in a courtroom, and wondered whether he had the capacity at 66 years old to stand in front of a judge and talk about Clara and what she'd built without it being obvious that he was also talking about everything he'd lost and everything he'd refused to claim. He supposed he would find out. Owen Stacks came to the ranch the next morning before his store opened, which was unusual enough in itself to constitute a statement. He came on horseback rather than in his wagon, wearing his riding clothes, the flannel shirt and the heavy wool coat and the work hat rather than anything he'd put on for town. He tied his horse at the post and came to the kitchen door and knocked, which he'd never done before, and when Gideon opened it, Owen was holding his hat in his hands, in the manner of a man who had come to say something he'd prepared. "Sit down," Gideon said. Owen sat at the kitchen table. He turned his hat in his hands once and set it on the table and looked at you, Gideon, with the expression of a man who'd spent the previous night working through a decision and had arrived at it. "I want to help with the legal costs." He said it without setup, the prepared part stripped away and just the statement left, not as a loan, as a contribution. "I've been thinking about what Clara Trace meant to this valley, to my family specifically, how she and you both did right by my father when the store was struggling and nobody had any reason to extend us any credit, but they did. And I've been thinking about what you're up against with Moss, who has more lawyers than most people in this county have horses." He put both hands flat on the table. "I'm buying 5 acres off your eastern boundary. I've had my eye on that parcel for 3 years for the water access. I'll pay a fair price, market rate, whatever Ruth Kane says the legal retainer requires." Gideon looked at him. "I know you're going to argue," Owen said. "So I'm asking you not to. I'm not doing it for you exactly. I'm doing it because it's the right thing, and because my father would have done it, and because Moss winning this would mean something I don't want it to mean about how things work in this valley." Gideon was quiet for a long moment. The right thing to say was not what he wanted to say, which was that he could manage it himself and didn't need anyone's charity. But what he wanted to say was not the true thing, and Clara's voice in his memory was extremely clear on the subject of the difference between pride and wisdom. "That parcel's worth more than a legal retainer. Then put the difference in the ranch account and fix the fence on the north side, which has been leaning since before I can remember." Owen picked up his hat. "I'll have the papers drawn up through Holt's office. Don't make it complicated." He left the way he'd come, direct and without ceremony, and Gideon stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him ride back down the valley road and felt the particular discomfort of receiving something he hadn't asked for and couldn't easily refuse, which was a different kind of vulnerability than than the kind he was accustomed to. That afternoon, Alma Briggs came with news. She had found the correspondence. Not through any single source, but through the network of breeders and handlers and ranch operators that she'd been working for 2 weeks. The community of people who knew horses and knew each other, and kept records because records were how you protected what you'd built. A handler in the Billings district, a man named Forsyth, who had operated as a middleman in the estate sale of Samuel Reed's operation, had kept his own files. Forsyth was not difficult to find. He was not difficult to talk to. Once Alma had explained what she was looking for and why, he had produced from his own records a letter from an agent representing Colonel Arden Moss, dated 6 weeks before the estate auction, which asked a single specific question: whether any of the horses in the Reed estate were subject to prior claim or testamentary restriction. Forsyth had replied that there was a clause in the Reed will regarding animals carrying a specific brand, and had described the clause accurately, including Gideon's name as the designated priority recipient. Moss's agent had replied that this was noted, and had proceeded to instruct Forsyth to acquire the animals regardless, through the standard auction process, framing the instruction around the legal argument that testamentary priority clauses, without active monitoring or enforcement, had limited practical standing in probate proceedings, which was a legal opinion, possibly even a defensible one. But it was also, as Ruth Kane said when Alma brought the correspondence to the kitchen table that afternoon, and Ruth reviewed it for 40 minutes without saying anything, precisely what she had been looking for. He knew, Ruth said. Not with satisfaction, but with the flat certainty of a woman who had located the weight-bearing element of a structure, and confirmed it would hold what she needed it to hold. This isn't ambiguity or oversight. This is deliberate navigation around a legal obligation on the theory that the obligation was technically weak enough to ignore. She set the letter down with the care of someone handling something important. Courts don't like that. Whatever the merits of Moss's legal theory, the optics of this are a man with substantial resources choosing to circumvent a widow's directive about her own horses, because he calculated that the person protected by the directive lacked the resources to enforce it. That's accurate, Gideon said. Yes. And it will be accurate in front of a judge, stated plainly and without embellishment, because the plain statement is already damning. She looked across the table at Alma. How reliable is Forsyth as a witness? He's a working man who kept clean records and doesn't owe Moss anything. Alma's voice was matter of fact. He kept the correspondence because he knew at the time that what he was being asked to do wasn't right, and men who know they've done something wrong tend to keep the evidence of it, in case they ever need to prove that the wrong came from somewhere above them. He'll say so if asked. Get me a written statement from him before the hearing. Ruth gathered the correspondence carefully, and a deposition if he'll consent to one. Gideon looked at the papers on the table. The accumulated evidence of 2 weeks of Alma's work, Owen's land sale, Ruth's analysis, Holt's steady presence at the edges of the situation. He had not asked any of them for what they were giving him. He had received it the way Midnight had received him in that first session in the stall, by being still enough that the approach could happen, by not closing himself against what was coming toward him. The thought arrived in him with a quality he didn't immediately identify, and then identified as gratitude, which he had not felt in its full dimension in a very long time. 3 days before the scheduled hearing, Moss sent a second representative to the ranch, not the riders from before. A single man, young, wearing a good suit that was somewhat incongruous in the Redstone Valley, who presented himself as an attorney from Moss's Helena firm, and who requested a private meeting with Gideon on his client's behalf. Gideon told him to wait at the gate and sent the boy from the neighboring spread, who sometimes ran errands, to fetch Ruth Kane. And 20 minutes later, Ruth was standing in the yard beside Gideon when the attorney made his presentation. The presentation was an offer, more organized and formally stated than Moss's original one. A specific number this time, substantial enough that it represented genuine consideration rather than a dismissive gesture. In addition to the purchase price, compensation for the period of housing and care, a written acknowledgement that the CT brand had historical significance, and a proposed arrangement whereby Gideon would be consulted as an expert advisor on the breeding program Moss intended to develop. Gideon listened to all of it. Ruth listened beside him with her hands folded and her face offering nothing. When the attorney had finished, Gideon took the approximate 4 seconds it required to confirm that his answers was what it had been from the beginning. No. The attorney's expression shifted through surprise and recalibration. Mr. Trace, I want to be sure you understand the scope of what's being offered here, the figure. I understand the figure. Gideon kept his voice level, not because he wasn't feeling the weight of what he was refusing, but because the weight of it was the right weight, and refusing to feel it would have been dishonest. The horse is not for sale. The program my wife built is not for sale. I'm prepared to make that case in front of a judge if Colonel Moss requires a court to confirm it. The attorney looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at the attorney with the expression of a woman who was waiting for the conversation to conclude so she could get back to work. My client's position is stated, she said. Thank you for coming out. After the attorney's horse had disappeared around the bend in the road, Ruth turned to Gideon with the first expression she'd shown him. That was not purely professional. It was brief and contained, but it was there. That was the right call, she said. And I say that not as your attorney, but as someone who has read enough of your wife's papers to understand what she thought was worth protecting. He did not respond to that directly, because direct responses to certain kinds of acknowledgement were things he had never been able to produce without the response being less than what it was answering. Instead, he said, "How are we positioned for Thursday?" "Better than we were Monday." She turned back toward the house, the document case under her arm. "Not as good as I'd like, but the Forsyth statement came through this morning and it's clean. If the judge gives it the weight it deserves, Moss's acquisition is going to look like exactly what it was." The day before the hearing, Gideon worked midnight in the paddock for the full morning session. He had not skipped a session since the first morning after midnight's arrival. Not when Moss came with riders, not during the storm, not through the week of legal preparation and Owen's land sale and Ruth's document review. The sessions had been the fixed point around which everything else had arranged itself. The part of each day that was not about the fight or the fear or the accumulated weight of 23 years of avoidance, but simply about the work. What had developed between them in those sessions was not reducible to training. It had the quality of training in the sense that specific skills were being built and specific communication was being established. But it also had something beyond that. The thing Clara had written about in her notebooks, the particular register of engagement between a horse and a person that happened when both parties were genuinely attending to the same thing. Midnight anticipated him now. Not in the way of a horse that had learned to predict commands in order to avoid them, but in the way of an animal that had begun to understand the purpose behind the cues, and was meeting that purpose rather than the cue itself. Clara had spent 30 years trying to breed for that quality. She had believed it was inheritable, that the capacity for genuine partnership was a heritable trait like conformation or temperament, and she had structured her entire program around selecting for it. Midnight was the culmination of 15 additional years of that selection, refined and concentrated by Samuel Reed's faithful stewardship of her principles. He was, in the most literal sense, everything she had worked toward. Gideon brought him to a halt in the center of the paddock as the afternoon light began its decline, and stood beside him in the way he'd learned to stand, which was less about position and more about presence, being genuinely there, rather than physically present with his attention somewhere else. Midnight stood with his hip dropped on one side, ears at half-mast, the posture of an animal that was comfortable enough in its current location to be at rest in it. He pulled Clara's letter from his vest pocket. Not to read it, he'd read it enough times by now that it was in him rather than on the page, but to hold it in the same hand that rested on Midnight's neck, the paper and the warm hide together, two things that connected to the same source by different paths. The valley was doing the thing it did in late October afternoons, the specific quality of light that came when the sun was low enough to be amber but not yet low enough to be gone. The mountains holding their color one last hour before the temperature dropped and the night came in from the east. He stood in that light and held the letter and the horse's warmth and said, not loudly, not with the formal address he used in the nightly accounting on the porch, but in the simpler register of someone speaking to the nearest available ear, whatever happens tomorrow. I want you to know I understand now what you were doing, why you set it up the way you did, and that I'm not going to let it have been for nothing. Midnight shifted his weight, a small adjustment, and leaned fractionally into Gideon's hand. That evening Holt Decker came and Owen Stacks came, and the three of them sat on the porch in the cold with good whiskey from the bottle Owen had brought and talked about things that were not the hearing, the weather turning, the Morrison water claim that had been resolved in the Morrisons' favor, a stray gelding that had turned up with a brand Holt had eventually traced to a ranch in the next county. The ordinary, ongoing machinery of a valley continuing to function, regardless of the specific crises of its individual inhabitants. At a certain point Owen looked out at the barn where the lamp glow was visible through the high window. The light Gideon kept burning low in the aisle for the horse's comfort, and said, "I remember the year Clara's first breeding season produced its first real results. My father brought me to the sale. I was maybe 20, and I watched people from 3 states come to look at those horses, the way they talked about them." He turned his glass in his hand, like they were looking at something they'd been told didn't exist and then it did. Holt was quiet for a moment. "That's what you're going to court for tomorrow," he said. "Not just the horse, all of it." Gideon looked at his glass. "I know that. I'm just saying it plainly because it's worth saying plainly." Holt shifted in his chair, the old joints making their standard accommodations. "You've been carrying this 23 years as a loss, and it wasn't only a loss. Some of it survived. Some of it's in that barn right now, and some of it's in those breeding records, and some of it's in what Reed did for 15 years because she asked him to. That doesn't erase what you lost. But it's not only loss. The night air was very cold and very clear. The stars were the dense, close-seeming stars of high country on a moonless night." Gideon finished his whiskey and held the empty glass and looked at the barn. He went to the barn one last time before bed. He did not make the nightly accounting speech. He had made that speech every night for 23 years to an empty yard, and it had served its purpose, the purpose of a man keeping a small lamp lit in an otherwise dark house, and it had been enough for what it was. But tonight what it was felt different. Not ended exactly, more like graduated. Midnight raised his head when Gideon came into the barn aisle, the specific lifting of attention that had become the greeting between them, immediate and oriented and personal, in the way that a creature's recognition of a particular individual was always personal. Gideon came to the stall and put his forearms on the top rail and looked at the horse, who looked back. Everything that was going to happen tomorrow was already in motion. The documents were prepared. Ruth Kane had done what could be done with the time and the evidence available. Forsyth's statement was in the file. Owen's land sale had funded the retainer. Holt would be in the courtroom. Alma would be there. The valley had arranged itself around this, in the way that communities arranged themselves, around the things that mattered to their own understanding of themselves. The things that said something about what kind of place this was, and what kind of people lived here. He had done everything he could do. What remained was to stand in front of a judge tomorrow and be the person who could explain, in specific and unemotional terms, why a dead woman's brand on a living horse meant something that legal paperwork alone could not encompass. He was 66 years old and had spent 23 years becoming someone who could not do that, and he had spent the last 3 weeks becoming someone who might. He put his hand on Midnight's forehead between the eyes in the place where the bone was solid and the warmth came through it, and held it there for a moment. The horse leaned in. That small, steady pressure. Present. Here. Belonging. Gideon took his hand back. He picked up the lantern from its hook and turned the wick down to its lowest useful point, the level that left enough light to navigate but drew the night close. He walked the length of the barn aisle and out through the door into the cold, clear dark of the yard. He did not say anything to the sky or the valley or the space where Clara's presence had been for 23 years. He did not need to. He had said what needed saying in the barn, with his hand and the horse's warmth and the quality of attention that passed between them. And the rest was in the letter in his pocket and the records in the drawer and the 5 notebooks from the tin box on the shelf, and all of that together was sufficient. He went inside and wound the clock. He went to bed on his side of the mattress and looked at the ceiling in the dark, and thought about nothing specific, which was itself a new thing. The capacity to be present in the moment before sleep without the past rushing in to fill every available space. The clock ticked, the night settled. The valley held its cold and its clarity and its vast particular silence. He slept, and the sleeping was deep and without complication. The sleep of a man who has made his preparations and accepted the forward edge of what is coming, and who has nothing left to do tonight but rest. The courthouse occupied the corner where Main met the North Road, and on the morning of the hearing it held more people than it had been designed for. Not because Redstone was a large town. Because the valley had one of those informal communication systems that operated through feed store conversations and post-road riders, and the particular speed with which significant information moved through communities, small enough that everyone's business eventually became everyone's awareness. People had known about the hearing for 4 days. They had arranged themselves accordingly. Gideon drove the wagon from the ranch in the early dark, with midnight on a lead line behind it. This had been his own decision, made 3 days before without consulting Ruth or Holt, and when he'd told Holt about it, the marshal had looked at the horse, and then at Gideon and said nothing, which was Holt's way of indicating agreement. The horse's presence at the courthouse would be visible before a word was spoken inside. A judge who could look out a second-floor window and see the animal in question standing at the post would be looking at evidence that no document could fully capture. The relationship between Gideon and Midnight expressed in the simple fact of how the horse stood when Gideon tied the lead and walked away. Midnight stood without pulling. His ears tracked the street sounds with alert curiosity rather than alarm. When a freight wagon rattled past on the adjacent road and the horses in harness shied at something in the ditch, Midnight turned his head to look and then turned it back, settled present. The product of 30 days of daily work that had built something durable enough to hold in an unfamiliar environment with unfamiliar noise. Gideon left him at the post and went up the courthouse steps. The courtroom ran the full length of the second floor. Oak benches worn smooth by a decade of use. Pine floors that had absorbed the particular smell of boots and wool and human attention over many proceedings. The judge's bench sat elevated at the far end on a platform that did its job without being theatrical about it. 3 windows on the west wall let in the October light at an angle that would shift across the room as the morning advanced. Moss was already at the right-hand table, with 2 attorneys Gideon had not seen before the hearing. Men with city suits and organized papers, and the quiet efficiency of people who litigated as their daily work and had systems for managing that work at scale. Moss himself wore a dark wool coat and a cravat in deep burgundy, and he sat between his attorneys with the composure of a man who had decided the outcome in advance and was present as a formality. He did not look at Gideon when Gideon came in. He looked at the papers in front of him with the focused attention of someone reviewing a position he'd already confirmed was sound. Ruth Kane was at the left table. Her document case was open. The Forsyth correspondence arranged in the specific order she'd explained to Gideon the evening before. The breeding record stacked beside it, with the relevant pages marked. She looked up when Gideon took the chair beside her, and gave him the assessment she always gave him, direct and without performance. We are as prepared as preparation allows. The benches filled. Owen Stacks in the second row, his store in his assistant's care for the morning. Alma Briggs beside him, wearing the dark green wool dress she reserved for occasions that required more than work clothes. Jim Hensley from the Northern Spread. The Pattersons. A dozen people Gideon knew by name and twice, that whose faces had accumulated in his awareness over 40 years in the valley. They settled onto the benches with the low murmur of a community that understood the gravity of the room and was observing it without having to be told to. Holt stood at the side wall in his capacity as marshal, which meant official neutrality and personal interest in the outcome, and anyone who looked at his face for more than a moment would have understood which of those 2 things was doing more work this morning. Judge Elias Marsh entered at precisely the stated time. He was lean, gray, 60 or near it, and he moved to the bench with the compression of long practice, the ritual reduced to its necessary gestures. He surveyed the room once, the full sweep of a man reading a situation before committing to his role in it, and then he opened the file. Pierce, the lead attorney for Moss, opened with the technical argument. He was good at it. He laid the chain of title cleanly, the Reed estate sale, the auction proceeding, the purchase through the middleman, the bill of sale, the registration transfer, the documented payment. Each link in the chain presented in sequence, each document referenced by exhibit number. It was the argument of a man who understood that legal proceedings rewarded precision over feeling and had prepared accordingly. When he sat down, the case for Moss looked exactly as strong as it was on paper, which was genuinely strong. Ruth stood. She brought the closed notebook and nothing else, and she stood at the position in front of the judge's bench that the court used for formal address, And she began not with Clara's name but with a question she directed at the room rather than at Marsh, the kind of question that did not require an answer, because the answer was already present in the facts she was about to present. She asked what a breeding program was in the precise sense, not the commercial sense, the craft sense. The sense in which a person who spent 30 years developing a specific heritable trait in a line of animals was doing something closer to what a craftsman did than what a merchant did, building an accumulated understanding into the work itself, so that the work carried forward something of the person who made it. Then she moved to Clara Trace. Dates, documentation, the specific principles Clara had established and recorded in the breeding notebooks that were now exhibits in the file, the temperament work, the intelligence selection, the documented outcomes over 3 decades of careful breeding decisions. She presented it as what it was, a factual record of a serious and sustained creative and scientific effort, without sentiment and without embellishment. From Clara to Samuel Reed. The reconciliation, the arrangement, the 15 years of stewardship in the Billings operation. The will clause, read into the record in its full language, with Gideon's name in it and the obligation it established for any party disposing of the Reed estate's animals. Then she put the Forsyth correspondence on the record. She read the relevant exchange without commentary, the question from Moss's agent about prior claim or testamentary restriction, Forsyth's accurate description of the will clause including Gideon's name, and the instruction from Moss's agent to proceed with acquisition regardless. She read it in the same voice she'd used for everything else, because the plain reading was already the argument. Ornamentation would only have diluted it. She sat down. Pierce objected on grounds Gideon did not fully follow legal terminology about the enforceability of testamentary priority clauses in probate proceedings. Marsh listened to the objection without expression and then looked at Ruth for her response. Ruth gave it in 3 sentences that were specific enough to be useful and brief enough to signal that she considered the objection a minor obstacle rather than a serious challenge. Marsh noted both positions and moved on. "I want to hear from the plaintiff," Marsh said. "Mr. Trace." Gideon stood. The chair scraped on the pine floor, and the sound carried in the quiet room. He walked to the position in front of the bench and stood there with his hat in his hands, and looked at the judge, and the room behind him went completely still in the way rooms went still when they understood that something was about to be said that would matter. He did not begin with the brand, or the horse, or the legal argument. He began with the morning midnight arrived, because that was where the facts started, and because a true account started where the facts started. He described what he'd seen through the wagon slats, not to generate sympathy but to establish what quality of animal they were discussing, what the visual evidence of the breeding program looked like in living form. He kept it short. 2 sentences on the horse's conformation, 2 on the quality of attention in the eyes, and then the critical fact that when he'd checked midnight for identification, he'd found a brand under the mane that he recognized because he had been present when Clara designed it and when she first applied it. He described the brand in the way a man described something he knew without ambiguity. The size, the placement, the curve of the C that Clara had insisted on, because she thought straight letters looked incomplete. He said he knew this brand the way he knew his own signature, not by memory of a detail but by the body's recognition of something encountered so many times that recognition was immediate and certain. Then he stopped for a moment. Not for effect, because the next part required him to be accurate about something he had spent 23 years being inaccurate about in the privacy of his own accounting. "I sold Clara's horses in the 3 months after she died," he said. "I've told myself since then that I was being practical. I wasn't. I was running from something I didn't know how to face." He held the judge's attention without looking away from it. Clara apparently understood that would happen. She made arrangements before she died for someone to preserve the program. She documented those arrangements. She wrote me a letter explaining what she'd done and why, and she hid it where she knew I wouldn't find it until I was ready. He reached into his vest pocket and took out the letter. The paper was soft with handling, the folds worn along their lines from weeks of being opened and closed and carried close. He unfolded it without hurrying. "Your Honor, I'd like to read one passage." Marsh nodded. Gideon found the line and read it in the voice he'd been using throughout, plain and direct, the voice of someone reading a true thing rather than performing one. "You were never broken by what happened to me. You were only stopped. Those are different things. Stopped means you can start again. He folded the letter. He put it back in his pocket over his heart, which was where it had been for 5 weeks. He looked at the judge. The horse in question is the culmination of what my wife built, not a similar animal, not a descendant that happened to share some characteristics. The culmination, the thing her program was designed to produce, preserved through 15 additional years of faithful work, by a man who kept faith with her intentions after I failed to keep faith with them myself. He paused. I'm not asking this court to give me the horse because I feel attached to him. I'm asking the court to recognize that my wife documented her intentions in legally specific language, that those intentions were violated in the disposal of her cousin's estate by a party that knew the violation was occurring, and that what's at stake is whether documented intentions mean anything when the person with the resources to ignore them calculates that the person protected by them lacks the resources to enforce them. He went back to his chair. The room held its quiet for a moment that was long enough to be felt by everyone in it. Marsh looked at his papers. He looked at the Forsyth correspondence. He looked at the will clause. He looked at the copy of Clara's letter that Ruth had submitted as a documentary exhibit alongside the breeding records and the bloodline documentation. Then he looked at Moss. Colonel Moss. Marsh's voice had the quality of a man who had something specific he wanted on the record before he ruled. You declined to present personal testimony, which is your right. I'm not requiring you to speak, but I want to give you the opportunity, before I rule, to address one specific point. Your agent's correspondence with Forsyth establishes that someone acting on your behalf knew the will clause existed before the purchase proceeded. I'd like to know whether that knowledge was reported to you personally. The two attorneys leaned toward Moss simultaneously. Pierce's voice was low and precise, the advice of a professional managing a situation. Moss listened. He sat with the correspondence in front of him, the document that had been the weight-bearing element of Ruth's case, and he looked at it for a moment with an expression that was not the composure he'd maintained throughout the proceeding. Not broken, but altered in some way that the composure had been covering. He straightened. He looked at the judge. My agent reported the clause to me before the purchase. He said it without inflection, the statement of a man who had decided that the record should reflect the truth of this particular fact. I made the decision to proceed on the legal theory that the clause was technically unenforceable without active notice and documented enforcement. He stopped. Pierce's hand moved toward his arm and Moss moved his arm slightly away from it. I also knew the provenance of the bloodline. I had researched the Trace program before purchasing. I knew the quality of what Samuel Reed had maintained and where it originated. Another pause, shorter. I knew whose work it was. The room absorbed this. Marsh looked at Moss for a long moment, not with judgment in the theatrical sense, but with the attention of a man confirming that what he'd heard was what had been said. Then he looked at his notes and began writing, and the room held the particular silence of people waiting for the formal statement of something they had already understood. Moss sat back. He was looking at the correspondence again, not at Gideon, not at the judge. At the document itself, the record of his agent's question and the instruction to proceed regardless. His jaw held its line. But there was something underneath the held line that had not been there when he'd walked into the courtroom, and it was not the thing he'd come here planning to feel. Gideon looked at him from across the room. He had looked at Moss from the ranch gate and from across the table in the original confrontation, and across the distance of the marshal's presence in the yard. And each time he had read the man as calculation-wearing patience, the cold management of outcomes by someone with enough resources to make management reliable. What he was looking at now was not that, or not only that. What was underneath the composure, visible now in the specific way that Moss held himself without quite looking at anyone, was something Gideon recognized from the inside. The particular posture of a man carrying a loss he had never learned to carry correctly, and who had built systems around the carrying to keep it from showing, and who was sitting in a courtroom in a small Montana town, having those systems examined in public and found wanting. Gideon had spent 23 years building his own version of those systems. The empty barn, and the single plate, and the nightly accounting to the dark yard. The difference between his systems and Moss's was mostly in the direction they pointed, inward and backward for Gideon, outward and acquisitive for Moss. But they came from the same original wound, the attempt to manage something unmanageable by substituting control for what could not be controlled. He did not feel warmth toward Moss. He felt something more accurate and less comfortable than warmth, the recognition of a shape he knew from long acquaintance, in a man he had every reason to regard as an opponent. Marsh set his pen down. This court finds as follows. The cadence of formal pronouncement, words going into a record. The will clause of Samuel Reed constitutes a binding testamentary obligation with respect to animals bearing the CT brand. The failure to honor that obligation during the estate sale proceedings was not oversight but deliberate circumvention, established by the Forsyth correspondence and confirmed by the defendant's own testimony. The purchase of the stallion designated Midnight by Colonel Arden Moss through that flawed process does not confer complete and uncontested title. Pierce was writing rapidly. His co-counsel had already pulled a fresh sheet toward him. This court further finds that the CT brand constitutes a documented mark of provenance, carrying legal significance established by the originating breeder's intent and confirmed by Samuel Reed's testamentary language. The stallion Midnight is remanded to the custody of Gideon Trace as the designated recipient under the Reed will clause. Colonel Moss will be reimbursed his documented purchase price through a process this court will oversee and schedule separately. Marsh looked at the room over his papers, the full survey again, before the final portion. Additionally, this court enters into the county record that any horse bearing the CT mark and traceable to the Trace breeding program carries with it the priority claim established by the Reed clause. Any future disposition of such animals must offer first right of purchase to Gideon Trace or his designated heir before sale to third parties. This protection is entered as a matter of permanent record in this jurisdiction. The gavel came down. The sound it made was not large. It never was. But it had the quality of a mechanism completing its designed function, and the room responded to it with the collective release of people who had been holding something and had been given permission to set it down. Moss rose from his chair. His attorneys gathered papers around him with practiced efficiency, the transition from proceeding to aftermath that legal professionals managed without drama. But Moss himself stood still for a moment at the table, not moving toward the door, looking at the document in his hand, the Forsyth correspondence that had been the instrument of his own undoing. He looked up. Across the room, he found Gideon's eyes. He held the look for 2 seconds. 3. The composure was back in place, or something enough like it that the difference was only visible if you had been watching him throughout. Then he set the document on the table with the deliberateness of a man putting something down that he is not going to pick up again, and he walked toward the door with his attorneys without stopping. At the door he paused, his back to the room, one hand on the frame. He did not turn. He said, to the door, or to the air in front of it, or to no one in particular, in the voice of a man making a statement for the record that the record would not capture. She built something worth keeping. Then he went through the door and his footsteps descended the staircase, and the room breathed again. Ruth was organizing her document case with the focused economy of someone moving from one completed task to the next. She glanced at Gideon with the expression she'd given him throughout, factual and steady, and said, "Go get your horse." He went down the courthouse stairs and out into the October morning. The street held the people who had been inside and the people who had been outside since the morning began, the accumulated presence of a community that had arranged itself around this. Owen was on the steps, Alma beside him, the green dress catching the light. Holt had come down before Gideon and stood near the post where Midnight was tied, not positioned there deliberately, but present in the way he was always present when something mattered. Midnight heard Gideon on the wooden steps before he saw him, the ears swiveling, and then the full turn of the head, the body orienting the way it had oriented every morning for 30 days when Gideon came through the barn door. Not the general attention of a horse registering human approach. The specific recognition of this person, sorted immediately from everything else in the environment, and responded to with the particular quality of an animal that had decided where its allegiance was, and held that decision consistently. Gideon came off the last step and crossed the walkway and put his hand on Midnight's neck. The warmth came through the black coat the way it always did, immediate and alive, the pulse steady underneath. He stood there with his hand on the horse, and his face to the western end of Main Street, where the road opened into the valley, and he did not perform anything for the people watching, because there was nothing to perform. This was simply what it was. Owen started clapping from the steps. Slow and deliberate, the sound of a man marking something rather than celebrating it, the difference between acknowledgement and applause. It moved through the people on the street the way genuine things moved through communities, finding its level without being directed, becoming what it was going to be without anyone deciding what that should look like. Not a roar. The measured, honest sound of people who had witnessed something they recognized as right and were saying so. Gideon stood with his hand on Midnight's neck and let the sound be what it was. He was not restored. He was 66 years old, and the legal proceeding was over. But the work that followed it was just beginning, the mares to select, the breeding decisions to make, the program to rebuild from a foundation that Clara had laid, and Samuel Reed had preserved, and that had been waiting in a freight yard in Billings for the clerical error that would send it home. He was tired in the specific way of a man who had spent 5 weeks at the edge of his own capacity, and had not yet had the opportunity to step back from that edge and rest. And he was standing in the October light on the main street of Redstone, with his hand on a black horse that should not exist, something he had not been in a very long time. Not happy exactly. Happiness was a word for simpler states than this one. What he was present. Genuinely present, in the way that he had not been present since the morning of Clara's funeral when he had made the decision, not consciously but completely, to remove himself from the forward motion of his own life and become instead a man who maintained its forms without inhabiting them. The forms had always been there. The coffee at dawn, the boots by the door, the nightly accounting to the dark yard. The forms were how you survived when surviving was the only thing you could manage. But survival and inhabitation were not the same condition, and he had been surviving for 23 years. And this morning, on a street in a small Montana town, with a community standing witness to a judge's ruling and a horse that carried a dead woman's brand, he was doing the other thing. He reached into his vest pocket with his free hand. Clara's letter was there, had been there since the night he found it in the tin box behind the barn wall, worn soft by 5 weeks of daily contact. He did not take it out. He pressed his palm flat against it through the wool of the vest, feeling the shape of it, the specific weight of folded paper that contained the most direct communication he had ever received from the person who had known him most completely. Stopped means you can start again. He took his hand from the letter. He untied Midnight's lead from the post, and the horse stepped toward him as the line went slack, closing the distance between them with the easy confidence of an animal that knew where it was supposed to be. They walked together down Main Street toward the wagon, the man and the black horse, in the October light of a morning that had settled something that had been unsettled for 23 years, and the people of Redstone watched them go, with the particular quiet of a community that has seen what it needed to see and does not require anything further to be said about it. 6 months later, the spring came into the valley in the way it always came, without asking whether the winter was finished, pushing through the last cold with the indifference of something on its own schedule. The grass in the lower pastures returned to the green it was only briefly each year before summer dried it toward gold. The mountains dropped their snowpack into the creeks, and the creeks ran high and loud and clear. The barn held 6 occupied stalls, Midnight in the largest. 5 mares selected through the winter from what remained findable of animals, carrying traceable connection to Clara's original program. Chosen against the standards documented in her breeding notebooks. Chosen the way Clara would have chosen them, with temperament weighted equally against conformation, and the capacity for genuine engagement weighted above both. The breeding records Gideon kept were in a new notebook, his handwriting rather than Clara's, his analytical framework built from the implementer's side of the work rather than the designer's. He was learning the designer's side from the notebooks she'd left, the 5 personal ones from the tin box and the official program records from the drawer. Reading them the way you read a technical document written by someone more advanced in the subject than you were. Slowly and with the understanding that comprehension would come in layers, rather than all at once. He was at the paddock fence on a morning in late April when Alma's wagon came through the gate. She had been coming every day for 3 months. The veterinary necessity of the mare's settling period had been genuine in the first weeks, and had become something else in the gradual way that things became something else between people who stopped being careful about maintaining a working distance. He had not named what it was becoming. He had put an additional cup on the shelf above the cookstove sometime in February, and had not examined the decision closely. She came to the fence and stood beside him, and looked at what he was looking at, which was Midnight working the lower end of the paddock in the self-directed movement of an animal, with space and light, and enough to engage him. She had been watching this paddock long enough to know its rhythms, and she watched now without asking what she was looking at. Henderson Ranch sent word, she said, her eyes on the paddock. They want to discuss a breeding arrangement for next season. Their bloodlines are sound. He watched Midnight move. Clara rated their operation in the notebooks. I know, I read that section. She had read all of them by now, with his encouragement, because the veterinary side of what Clara had been doing required someone who understood it from the inside, and Alma understood it in ways that clarified things for Gideon that the notebooks alone had not clarified. What she was building. What Reed continued. She paused. It's worth continuing past this season. He looked at the paddock, at the horse that was the culmination of 50 years of two people's best, thinking about what a horse could be, moving across spring grass in the morning light with the integrated power and attention that Clara had spent her life selecting for. He thought about the Henderson arrangement, and the mare east of Helena he'd written to about last month, and the 2 additional stalls he'd been considering building onto the barn's north end before the summer. He thought about the cup on the shelf. He did not say anything about any of these things directly, because directness of the declarative kind had never been the register in which he operated, and 40 years had not changed that, and Alma had read him well enough by now to understand it. What he did was put his hand on the fence rail beside hers, his fingers adjacent to hers without covering them, the proximity that was not quite contact but was the territory immediately before it. She looked at his hand. Then she looked at the paddock. She moved her fingers 1 inch to the left. They stood at the fence in the April morning and watched Midnight move across the new grass, and the valley held them in the way. It held everything, with the particular indifference of a landscape that had been here before any of them, and would be here after, and within that indifference, the specific warmth of a morning, in which something that had been stopped was moving again. The stopped thing had started. Not loudly, not with announcement. In the way that most true things started, quietly, in the presence of someone who understood the value of what was beginning and did not require it to be larger than it was. The rest was just the work, the daily, patient, necessary work of building something worth keeping, in the time that remained, with the hands that were available. Which was, he had come to understand, exactly enough.